Studio System Guardian Angel has become a bit of an obsession for me. I only found out about it in the first place due to the developer's presence as an illustrator on social media, even figuring I'd probably enjoy it because Uwil was such a discerning and talented artist, and even though I had high hopes for the full game after playing the demo back in the day, I didn't expect I'd come to love it this much. You can probably tell that I have a lot to say, but since I'd rather most people experience the game on their own terms, I'll contain myself for a short review that I hope will convince you on your way. There's such a uniquely genius twist on the fixed camera survival horror genre present in just the mechanical baseline that it makes you wonder how nobody's ever thought of it before. And Studio System goes much further beyond, as if inspired by years of innovation on its own unique concept. Aside from that, the presentation of the game has an incredible surreal style that can't be found anywhere else, and the whole thing is dense with attention to detail in both level design and the writing. It's a game you'll definitely want to replay, not just because it's fun and has a short runtime, but also because the story is complex enough that you might come away getting something new out of it every time. I can honestly say the time I spent playing and replaying this game was worth its weight in gold. That's why I can't help but feel a little disheartened, not just from the game's relative obscurity, but also from the critical reception it has received. Even the positive reviews temper their praise with caveats or conditional recommendations alongside comparison. Now, I can understand skepticism. During my first playthrough, I questioned to what extent the turnabouts of the game and my efforts going through it would pay off, but the only thing I needed to alleviate my concern was playing the game through to the end while paying attention. And the bevy of updates put out the developer to patch up some minor flaws helped as well. I'm not the arbiter of all game critique, nor would I want to be, but I think the game deserves a better reputation than, at best, a way to pass time if you like classic Silent Hill. You know, because it's not like those people have anything better to do. So, I wanted to make a video. This will be, in part, a glowingly positive review, a defense of its quality against its harshest critics, a presentation of how I interpreted the work, and a documentation of both paratext and development information when relevant. I should quickly mention, before making this video, I reached out to the developer and asked if there was any standard I should uphold to avoid being disrespectful, and Uwil just said to avoid presenting my interpretation of the story as definitive. What I took from this is that Uwil wants to hear the various interpretations of Studio System, and in doing so myself, I'll be going over most of the game to lay the groundwork for what I think, which means you will be severely spoiled if you watch onward. Even if you're fine with that, I wouldn't want to color anyone's perception by having my take be the first thing they see. In the spirit of Uwil's one request, I would advise you to engage with the game on your own terms before hearing it filtered through my lens. Should that disclaimer be ineffective, I'm going to start off this video by talking about anything but the story, and I hope in doing so I'll make it sound cool enough that you'll want to leave this video immediately and play it yourself. I'm also going to talk about the previous already Circle game, Times Infinity, in enough detail that I feel compelled to point out that it's a game that costs $2. With that said, let's begin. It feels almost impossible to properly structure a discussion on this game because so much of it is worth talking about in unbroken detail, but everything connects to everything else. Speaking on one aspect means dipping into fragments of every other without being able to go in-depth, since you're trying to cover one thing at a time. But I suppose there is no better place to start than with the camera. Something you've undoubtedly noticed from simply observing the footage is that Studio System Guardian Angel uses a fixed camera, a style common among early 3D horror games. The developer's ability to set the position and orientation of each shot allows not just focus and design, but also the application of various filmic techniques. The camera can be used to direct the player to walk towards it, something done quite frequently throughout the whole game, or to set the mood of an otherwise uneventful segment of gameplay, such as these distant shots of protagonist Becky walking down the street that make her feel small, insignificant, and detached from the player. Considering the literal title of the game, the cinematic inspiration makes perfect sense, and you can really feel the commitment to carefully considered presentation even in just this introductory segment. The gameplay segments feature a lot of extraneous interactable details and assorted bits that lead the player around, my favorite of which is the radio tower pointing direction to walk and drawing attention to itself with visible radio waves, bringing to mind the obvious inspiration from Denpa genre works with the literal definition of Denpa. The thoughtful composition of cutscenes and the upfront abundance of CGs show that the fixed camera wasn't just a mechanical consideration either. Every part of the game displays that drive towards visuals that are both appealing and meaningful. I'll often rail on games that have a lengthy introduction, especially as a relative percentage of an average playthrough's duration. I think the best approach is generally to either give the player a taste of what's to come right away, or dive into the thick of it and worry about establishment later. The sooner you give the player a representative sample, the sooner they might get attached, so to speak. Despite this, I have no qualms with this game for starting off by giving what is essentially a style tour that goes on for minutes before we really get into the setting or any tutorial. That's because the stylization genuinely is important for understanding the substance of the work. The reason I started this video with an edited cutscene is because I wanted to first and foremost get across the atmosphere of the game. Not just because it speaks for itself so clearly that you can probably tell if you'd like it from that alone, but because it genuinely is such a central part. Therefore, it's a perfect approach for the game to do the same. But I may be getting off track. So let's return to the camera, because there's more to it than just presentation. The very first tutorial showcases that you can move the orientation of the camera from its fixed position by holding a button. This mode can be used to look around the room, grab and move objects, or aim and shoot at enemies. It's kind of like it turns into a first-person shooter, but with a different first person. This is where the game's subtitle comes in. You're not just playing as Becky, you're also her guardian angel. Or maybe that's more of a metaphor to help anthropomorphize the game's mechanics. And this so-called guardian angel is actually just Becky's own power, as the tutorial seems to imply. For the sake of clarity though, I will differentiate between Becky and the camera as different avatars of the player. From pretty early on, I got the feeling that there was some inspiration taken from the 2005 cult classic Killer 7, where you switch between a sliding or fixed camera view when you walk around and a first-person view when you want to shoot an enemy. This belief was later solidified when I played the previous already Circle game, Times Infinity, which has a mildly different but similarly evocative take on running around and switching to first-person aim. Fatal Frame might also be a source of inspiration for a similar system and having cameramen as ammo, but for brevity I'll just stick to dissection of the arguably more relevant Killer 7. But although this might be the origin for the camera system, there's a substantial difference which makes it more than mere imitation. In Killer 7, I feel like just in describing it, I can cleanly separate the two camera modes into distinct gameplay categories. One is for navigation, the other is for combat. I've seen Killer 7 described as basically a rail shooter, and I think that's a comparison which exemplifies the separation. In a typical rail shooter, exploration and navigation are effectively a non-element. The first-person shooting interface presents the only interactable challenge, and the rest is out of the player's control. Movement is handled, hopefully smoothly and/or stylishly, by the game itself, purely to provide variation in level design. The ability to move through a level in Killer 7 does allow for complexity in changing the distance between yourself and the enemy, but its combat system doesn't require such behavior, nor is it encouraged for high-level play. If the player is moving when there's an enemy around, they've either messed up or they're running past them, but that's obviously not the same as engaging in combat. You could say that Killer 7 is like a rail shooter with an adventure game spliced in the middle of it. Now, I don't mean this as some harsh takedown of Killer 7, especially because I did enjoy the exploratory segments both in their own right and for the texture they provided the rest of the game. It is, in fact, overwhelmingly common for games, especially if they're 3D, to be constructed in this way, where the mechanical elements of their design are not a mixture but rather an arrangement. But that's exactly how Studio System is not just different, but exceptional. This goes beyond even the combat, where you have to avoid and keep an eye on enemies while balancing shooting them as the camera or hitting them as Becky. Exploration and traversal don't just require you to maneuver Becky through a room, you have to use the camera to observe and understand the space you're in, or to grab objects either to solve a puzzle, move something out of Becky's way, or move something Becky is standing on. Even when there are segments more individualized to either Becky or the camera, they still operate in parallel with one another, as Becky's position will change the location and angle of the fixed camera. To put it another way, it's two systems combined, working together in harmony. Although it sounds complicated, the dual control quickly starts to feel natural, especially because the first area of the game tries to teach the player everything they might need. First, you are taught that grabbable objects can hurt enemies in the room where the enemy can't hurt you, and then you may be rewarded if you remember that in a room where the enemy comes out behind a large grabbable object. One room showcases that Becky can walk on grabbable platforms, and the same room with the large grabbable object builds upon the lesson by putting items up on a high shelf, challenging the player on their capacity to maneuver both a small box and Becky at the same time. Once you've cleared out the single enemy, you can take all the time you need to really figure out this skill and then apply it in the future. Using the camera as an aid for exploration doesn't have an explicit tutorial in the beginning section. It's more that the other mechanics intrinsically incentivize it. For example, in the room where you kill an enemy with a block, there's a mysterious metallic monster peeking into the scene. If you don't quite realize that at first, being forced to move the camera can put more of it into view, allowing you more opportunity to notice it. I think this is the best approach, making the action of observation effortlessly natural. The game expects that you'll eventually come to internalize the skill of looking around, instantly scanning every new room like a trained SWAT officer, and it will occasionally give you an extrinsic reward for doing so. It also occasionally gives some intrinsic satisfaction or intrigue by showing some interesting object just off screen. I can't think of a more perfect system for a horror game, where it can utilize the advantages of cinematic presentation, but also derive horror from asking the player to be brave enough to look at something on their own. And that's just one of the ways in which this guardian angel mechanic makes itself feel very different from most games with a fixed camera. A common point of praise for those aforementioned early 3D horror games was that the camera can make it feel like something is watching you, in turn making the experience generally scarier. You could say that the fixed camera generally gives the player a constant reminder of something they cannot control. And while for a bit in the start it seems like Studio System is emulating that exact feeling, it's completely flipped on its head when you gain control of the camera. Maybe you are being watched, but the something in question is a guardian angel. In fact, it's wrong to describe it as being watched, it's more like you're being watched over. I don't think it entirely loses the general unease factor, as you're still limited by camera placement and given more to worry about with the complexity of play, but the camera comes to represent a sense of security. In trying to prove my point about how unique this camera system is, I played a lot of similar games, so just to cover my bases, the only other thing I could find where you play as an anthropomorphized, movable fixed camera was 2016 dystopian stealth game Republique. But it's quite different, not just in genre, but also in the fact that you pretty much exclusively control the camera, with the protagonist being more of a partner character you have limited influence over, and you can't control both at the same time. That is the conclusion I've come to from the many hours I've spent playing these games. Studio System is truly one of a kind. Since I'm going on so much about the camera, I feel obligated to acknowledge the obvious. I just feel like discussions of tank controls are passé. I'm sure everyone has heard some variation of they require practice and are a limitation relative to 2D controls, but they're also a boon for fixed camera traversal, since you won't end up walking the wrong way when the camera transitions. But I find a lot of these discussions pointless because most big games that work like this make it so you don't have to play with the 3D controls if you don't want to, including this one. Personally though, I enjoy the rotational controls in Studio System, and I haven't even tried switching to directional control. Becky's turning radius is reasonable, and the only modulating factors are her ability to run and the quick turn button you have to double tap. Maybe it should have been single tap. But importantly, there's almost nothing that adds complication or restriction to Becky's maneuverability outside of the melee attack button. The effect this has on combat is something we'll discuss later, but importantly, everything is simple and functional. This actually motivated me to keep on the 3D controls in a lot of games I played as research for this video, and I had fun. The one criticism I might have is that the default button for grab being Q on the keyboard is a bit of an odd choice. Most other functions either don't overlap or they have ergonomic harmony with one another, but if you ever want to move Becky while you're grabbing something, you'll have to awkwardly change your grip or momentarily sacrifice some functionality. After my first couple playthroughs, I remapped it to the middle mouse button, which I think not only works well with everything else, but also cleanly separates control of Becky and the camera onto two hands and two devices, which just makes more sense to me. This was a secondary in the 2023 demo, but not in the full game for some reason. I don't know. This is probably irrelevant to those who experience a traditional controller playthrough. I think it's kind of incredible that this tiny little indie game has literally every form of controller support and is fully deck verified. There's even 2 official controller configurations for whether or not you want to use motion controls with the camera. If you're not using gyro aim, it's difficult to simultaneously control Becky and the camera on a normal controller, as the breadth of actions include the right joystick, right bumpers, and a face button, which at best requires a claw grip. There's also a notable lack of precision when using only the joystick to aim, compared to the natural precision you can get from the mouse. However, moving the camera by simply holding the controller is absolutely amazing. It makes for a very unique kinesthetic experience that serves the scary game well. Despite lacking fixed reference technology though, Studio System avoids the gyroscopic drift infamous for playing quite a few motion control centric titles, with only the pre-existing feature of the camera recentering its angle automatically when you're not moving it. Again, the ergonomic intention is clear with the camera controls and sprinting being relegated to bumpers and triggers, while the joysticks have redundant functions which minimizes the need to change grip. Most of the face buttons having nothing assigned to them is a bit odd, even though most feasible functions for them would be redundant, seeing as convenient redundancy is all over the place. But that's a trivial nitpick, especially in comparison to the abundance of attention to detail even relating to the control method. There's a whole tutorial where the control explanation is made diegetic, with the graphic and text changing based on if you're using keyboard or controller, even if you've remapped something. It's a bit easy to tell that controller support was a later addition because the diegetic acknowledgement is much more direct than the one for the mouse and keyboard. The 2023 demo had its own version of this, where instead of alluding to clicking, it displayed 2 mice. You can tell there was a bit of iteration that led to it fitting a more serious tone. It's also really funny to just have a bunch of papers with letter Q printed on it. There's so much attention to detail put into everything in the game, even this early on. One of my favorite little tidbits is that usually the menu shows off a binary image of Becky with line boil and different poses are animations for health, alongside your various resources. A good mix of style and function, and a really good showcase of Ull's artistic talent all in one place. But before the first save point, there's a completely different menu. It has pretty much no functionality, so you probably have no reason to even see this, but there's a unique graphical style and an indicator for Becky's grades. I find it kind of funny because in the 2023 demo, one character unfamiliar with Becky speculates that she's a C+ student, but no one ever addresses her comment, so its meaning in a vacuum was unclear. Now, in the full game, we can see that not only was a correct assessment, but it's important enough detail to have survived in some form across versions. All this really just affirms to me the first thing I thought about this game before I even knew how it would play, which is, as I said in the beginning, that I'd like it on an aesthetic level just because Ull is such a talented visual artist. I'm gonna put some examples on screen, there's no further commentary I could possibly provide my point here. I hadn't really known Uwell as a 3D artist, and although this kind of thing doesn't necessarily transfer perfectly across entirely different mediums, any fears about the game's visual identity were quickly assuaged by just the preview images. This game looks cool as hell. I don't want to come across as one of those techno-fetishist but the graphics type people. I mean, back when I got a really good computer, the first thing I did was play Yuminiki.flow. I can do anything. But I think that this is a game where just talking at length about how it looks is completely warranted. It's normal to observe and analyze paintings and sculptures for minutes and hours, but I feel like not a lot of people dwell on the environments or sprite sheets in a video game for very long. And there's a lot to appreciate here, but for the sake of being reasonable, I'll limit my discussion to only a few representative samples. First of all, what I'd gather as Uwell's primary expertise, the 2D character art. Becky's whole portrait uses only 12 distinct colors, and is drawn with no anti-aliasing. There's an almost sketchbook-like quality to the lines of the drawing, despite the crisp sharpness of the pixels. This technique gives the drawing both a sense of clarity through simplicity, but also allows for subtlety through minor detail, such as the complexity of Becky's eye bags and the believable folds and shading on her outfit. Her outline color is a dark brown instead of black, not only providing contrast against the often dark backgrounds of cutscenes, but giving her a subtly warmer appearance. The use of contrasting color temperature and brightness in her design highlights her face and collar in portrait, whereas on her model it helps make her head and hands stand out, which is important for gameplay clarity. Perhaps most imperceptibly of all, her head curves in just such a way to resemble the spiral of the golden ratio, the top of her eyelids resting just under the dividing line of the rectangle, making her visual appeal a matter of near mathematical perfection. The most obvious deviation from this is with the two locks of hair pointing outwards, which not only makes her silhouette more distinct, but also works as a source of characterization, with her being the only character to have distinctly unkempt hair. A lot of these traits, the application of color and aliasing, the way lines are drawn and used, silhouettes and shape language, can be observed in all the other character portraits and to some extent the unique CGs, so I'd be repeating myself if I went over each one individually. I could give some credit to the unique CGs, which embody many of the same traits of the portrait art while serving their own unique purpose in visual storytelling and general stylishness. But to speak broadly, I think Uwell's evolution as an artist has come to really suit this game. One can observe that the portraits in the 2021 demo align much more with the bright, loose, and stylishly busy look of Time's Infinity. Over time, the art turned sharper, cleaner, darker. That style was quite fitting for the general tone and theme of Time's Infinity, but I feel that the grim situations Becky finds herself in are helped by her more defined, angular features and relatively realistic proportions. The 2023 demo is sort of an intermediary point of this, a time when apparently the plan was to base the 2D style on the 3D models. Even the models have changed significantly between these versions, still recognizably constructed in a style similar to obscure Dreamcast action RPG Sengoku Turb, but now with different, slightly less exaggerated proportions. And just like the 2D assets, there's no anti-aliasing in this game, which probably doesn't come across well in this footage. Despite being simpler in comparison to the portraits, they have their own appeal and utility, such as the capacity for maintaining motion and depicting the full bodies of each character. They also have their own unique details, such as Becky's hair growing in real time. These models work well in the environments, fitting generally within the wide curve of abstraction, which is to say, there's a wide range of areas you'll find yourself in, from rooms which are realistically mundane or industrial to dreamlike surreal locations. There's also a bit of retro technological imagery, wires and computers being notable elements, but the most obvious example comes in the form of the save points, composed of 4 CRT monitors filling up the word save. You can trace a very obvious reference to the red square save points from Silent Hill, possibly a bit of inspiration from the TVs found in save rooms in Killer 7, and arguably a loose connection to the use of, at the time, equally retro typewriters in classic Resident Evil. Regarding the environment types, I don't want to undersell the dingy areas. The worst I can say is that the aesthetic is common among survival horror games, but that just means it's really effective. It works enough to be repeated. To paraphrase something I said before, the darkness provokes fear of the unknown, that anything could be lurking just outside of your view. The unsanitary elements like grime or rust or mold provoke disgust, a fear for our health. The damaged architecture makes us think about the danger of them, the possibility of injury or collapse. And there's not many corpses throughout the game, but the presence of death makes the player consider the possibility of death. These areas are scary enough on their own and are probably helped by the static filter, but I turned that off because it would make the footage look blurry. But I do feel the game is at its peak in the more abstract areas. The best thing the more realistic rooms do is provide necessary contrast for these impossible worlds to hit as hard as they do. It feels like a Heraclean task to describe anything about this, so I'll ground myself by only talking about 2 individual screens in the entire game. Here's the first one. For context, this area comes around the point where the game goes from testing the waters with bizarre imagery to throwing you in the deep end, fitting for what seems to be an island? I think there are 2 major aspects that contribute to the vibe, in a word. The first of which is an element of physical obfuscation. The bright misty sky obscuring the top top half of the level, the transparent fog dancing over the water itself hiding the shape and size of the landmass, the hazy and indistinct nature of everything gives it a dreamlike quality. The second aspect is a contrast between the abstract and the comprehensible, a combination which I feel draws emphasis on the purpose of the latter and the bizarre existence of the former. This can be observed with the water I just mentioned, which does behave like water, but has a texture of two different scrolling red and blue circles patterned atop it, like weird lily pads drifting alongside endless spotlights. For a bigger picture observation, the landmass that Becky stands upon has a sort of naturalistic form despite its low-resolution texture. I could almost take it as a low-quality rendering of solid stone, and thus the whole landscape as a bizarre beach. Upon this land is what I would call distinctly man-made architecture, looking like a massive factory stretching so tall you can't even see the top of it through the bright fog. The outside of the structure is fairly detailed for something you can barely see and hardly interact with. With only these few facts, you could maybe interpret this as a simple depiction of factory runoff. But then you look at everything else. The dark forked poles sticking out of the ground in the distant silo are one thing, but then you have black squares high in the sky with the 3D shapes just floating and rotating out in the middle of the water. There's an incongruity between the geometric perfection of the shapes and their completely arbitrary, almost haphazard positioning in the level. They are too unnatural to seem like emergent features of the environment, but too random and flawless to be some intentional creation of man. Despite these signs of humanity and earthly features, which are clearly here for a reason, it feels like you've stepped into some alien world. And the kicker is that Becky was literally just inside her school in Riverside, California a few minutes ago. You, the player, walked here on foot. I can't even focus on just how it looks because, again, everything comes together to contribute to the experience. This is one of my favorite examples of a low-intensity area in the game, so for my second example, I want to go with a more straightforwardly unsettling room. For context, after an intense confrontation, you find yourself in this short hallway that just puts you back in a previous area. It seems to me like this room is mostly meant as a short wind-down, and also to serve a subtle easing from the previous room and the next, combining both the harsh, unsettling surrealism of the red and black eyes with the dingy metal of the walkway. I consider the eyes a very effective tool for unsettling the player. They draw attention, being an important image for gameplay purposes, and tap into uncanny valley sensations or a fear of being watched. That fear factor is exacerbated here by the sheer impossibility of their presence as a solid spherical texture. In a way, they're quite simple, not just in how they're drawn, but in meaning and effect on the player. But there's plenty of smaller details in the room that also achieve the same goal. Aside from the strong red glow, there's also a lot of very abrupt camera changes, all with off-kilter angles. The structure of the walkway is slightly asymmetrical, and the textures of it are slowly shifting. It all gives off the idea there's something wrong with even the more mundane parts of the room. If you are able to avert your gaze from the background texture, you'll start to notice these smaller details, giving the impression that nowhere in the room is really safe from discomfort. Not even at Becky, who herself is tinted with that red glow. This is a room you'll probably pass through in just a few seconds. It is nowhere near the most interesting room in the game. Honestly, it's probably one of the more forgettable locations. And yet, it has this much attention to detail, and it is perfectly suited to its attention. If even the most insignificant rooms are given this much, one can imagine the effort that's gone into all the more important rooms of the game. One thing I can really appreciate, aside from the effect of conveyance and mechanical systems, narrative tone, world building, and visual symbolism, is how the visual identity of the game is truly unique. A game being sufficiently stylish can be enough to make even a normal person defend anything, but I think aside from the obvious advantages, it serves this type of game particularly well. Horror games are everywhere, after all, and almost every type of scary aesthetic has already been depicted in some relatively mainstream work. So there's an advantage that Studio System has with its capacity to be unsettling that it can present a world with a style that's not quite like anything you've seen before. That's not to say it doesn't take any inspiration from other works. It's probably not hard to link the bloody and industrial style back to Silent Hill, or the cell shading to Killer 7, or the abstract dreamlike imagery to LSD, or the cute girls and tech stuff to Lane, but Studio System is different because it combines all these different elements into one work. Silent Hill doesn't contrast its horrific elements against cute characters. LSD doesn't contrast its surreal setting against oppressive mundanity, but Studio System does, and there's almost no other work like it. The closest I could think of would be .flow, a popular Yume Nikki fan game with a similar lineage of inspiration, but even with a bit of conversion evolution, Studio System differentiates and advances itself in comparison due to using techniques exclusive to 3D, also has fewer muses. The game's unique visual identity owes significant credit to the camera system. None of the aforementioned games have curated angles of view to frame everything, and not even the stated inspirations of Resident Evil nor Alone in the Dark allow the player to adjust those angles to see around more. Because, not to repeat myself, no game has a camera system like this one, which means that everything the player sees in the game is given a framing they're not likely to experience in anything else, putting another layer onto the already distinctive aesthetic. However, all these comparisons make one wonder, does it all mesh together well? Could the game be better served if, like its various inspirations, cutscenes all played out in-engine instead of of as visual novel-like segments? Well, the obvious response would be that we lose the well-drawn portraits, which probably aren't really worth whatever cinematography or graphical consistency could be displayed with the models. And it's not as if some 2.5D depictions of the characters in the world would work well with how many angles the game plays with. One could imagine, if we ignored the constraints of solo development or the individual style of the developer who produced the game with this presentation in the first place, what if the models were highly detailed and well proportioned, matching the style of the portraits more closely? And even ignoring the merits of the 3D models in their own right and assuming everything else would work fine, I would argue it might ultimately make the game less visually cohesive. With how abstract some environments can get, they're much better suited to a somewhat abstract character model. Even games that try to be surreal or bizarre will generally aim to have their assets land on a similar curve of abstraction, which is why I think the particular approach this game takes is probably the best that could have been done without the whole thing being almost unimaginably different. While we're on the matter of presentation, I'd also like to talk about the music and sound design. A lot of games with even a subtle horror theme use audible footsteps as a method of establishing atmosphere, emphasizing the vastness of a room and the presence of the player character within a level. As if not content to rest upon a proven trope, Studio System doesn't just have audible footsteps. Becky's walk layers constant, deep, distorted notes with a variable, harsh, metallic sound. This is probably one of my favorite things in the game. Most of the recurring sound effects in this game follow this trend, having some functional purpose but with a unique expression. The generic enemies will audibly emanate horns that get louder the closer you are and a static beat when they're chasing you. Aside from the obviously useful conveyance of danger that might not be immediately visually obvious, it puts the player on edge in a variety of scenarios, such as when an enemy is just out of the default angle for a view of the camera, or when the enemy can't even reach you or doesn't even exist. Enabling camera mode gives a soft click, and moving objects makes a variable warbling, both clear indications of the current state. The shot sound effect is pretty standard for a gunshot, but considering that's the most conventional mechanic of the bunch, I find it fitting. Same goes to the heavy whoosh of the bat moving through the air as you attack with it. I think it's good that every part of the moveset has an audio indication, as not all of them come with universal visual feedback, especially considering the limitation of camera angles or occlusion. Regarding cutscenes, there's no voice acting in the game. Every character is distinguished not just by portraits and unique dialogue windows, but also by their own talk sounds. I feel like the game makes good use of the text-only format here, while still effectively giving an impression of what the characters are meant to sound like. The cutscenes are also where you'll hear the bulk of the soundtrack, which I think has a lot of real hits. To speak broadly, there's a bit of electronic, a bit of rock, and then a lot of ambient and industrial. Bit of an interesting duality in the genre choice here. Ambient and industrial could be described as opposites, with one trying to be atmospheric and unobtrusive, and the other being extremely harsh and abrasive. And yet, they both draw some stylistic origins to rock and electronic. It's a real, well-fitting soundscape for the aesthetic and tone of the game. I should note that not every track in the game was made by Uwell. In approach to this, I didn't want to take away credit from anyone, especially not Uwell, who has said, quote, "The game was 95% made by me" on multiple occasions. This statistic is pretty well borne out from the fact that the other contributors don't seem to talk of the game too often. I know that auteurism is frowned upon because no human is an island, and in a collaborative process, everyone leaves a bit of their own mark on a given work. But I think there's something to be said for the selective power of a project lead. If something was, by whatever loose metric we're assuming, outside of the vision that Uwell had for the game, then it probably wouldn't be in the game. Even some things that Uwell made for the game ended up cut or altered after all. At the very least, everything in the game now would have had to be deemed just barely permissible, not so outside of the artistic vision that it would be bothersome. The same could be said even for a solo developer, that the limitations of what one can do on their own necessitate a compromise for their creative vision to be achieved in any complete form. In a way, working with others who have tools or a skill set that you do not might be the optimal way for an individual to achieve a specific creative vision. If Uwell were leading a large team to this end, then it might be easier to imagine how a specific design goal is shaped more by the general process of implementation than any specific person. But at most, it's an interface between two people, which makes the process much less of a defining factor. And I think Uwell chose the contributors quite well. The quality and variety of music in the game would be all but impossible to achieve by the hand of a single person, and the end product shows these are all quite talented people whose skills fit well within the rest of the work. Despite some similar instrumentation, I feel there's a lot I could say about the difference between the melancholic yet cozy bedroom band feeling of Dissociative Cycle, which carries a bit of nostalgia for me, since it was in the demo that I played, which you could say matches the intention of its use in Becky's Home. And the almost implaceable issue really like that I was never told such a thing, employing a piano with the attack removed to create some ambiguous feeling between calm and uneasy. perhaps fitting with the sense of unfamiliarity the title implies. And both of those are, of course, vastly different from Our Future, with its airy synth standing out among more traditional instruments and the deeper and harsher tones found in many of the other electronic tracks. Some interesting techniques can be noted in certain songs and their particular associations. Heaven contrasts the ethereal quality of the background synth and piano against the drum loop with ever-increasing stuttering, and it applies this song to two different scenarios of a monochrome setting corresponding with the character of Tomura, evocative in its suggestion of a connection or contrast. Tomura actually has a lot of songs dedicated to her, with the motif featured in What a Fun Part-Time Job showing up in a bunch of other tracks, most frequently in straight remixes or samples. Kind of funny that this song was one of the first in the game since the 2021 demo, used for basically every conversation cutscene there. Even though now in the full game it's only the theme of a particular character, it still feels like a track foundational to the game as a whole. One can observe some patterns among the soundtrack, notably that many of the songs are either droning tones or a short snippet that loops endlessly. I'm reminded of the Yume Nikki soundtrack to an extent, where the musical structure was well suited to a game with segments of theoretically infinite length, yet indeterminably variable pace. Not to say that Uwell or any other composer must have been directly inspired by Kikiyama in this regard, but the similar philosophy is noteworthy nonetheless. I did also notice the returning contributor L. Ron H., who composed for the previous Already Circle game, Times Infinity. If you play that game, I feel like it's easy to recognize some similarities of style in this one. That game had a lot of indie rock in its soundtrack. You just listen to the trailer song and you can get such a strong grasp for the tone and presentation of the whole project. This off-kilter sound evocative of youth culture, well suited to a game about a bunch of weird college kids. So it feels extremely fitting that the first track by L. Ron H. that you hear in Studio System is To Try, which plays on the radio while Tomoro starts up a conversation where she worries about Becky's future. I believe this is perhaps the only diegetic song in the whole game, and I feel like at least part of the intention behind that choice is because the scene also emphasizes the silence between the two characters. I actually kind of want to talk about Times Infinity right now, so I'll wrap this up quickly. The presentation is stylish, but not opulent or distracting. It's extremely functional in supporting the tone, the narrative, and the mechanics of the game. And on the topic of those mechanics, I feel that the most enlightening subject of discussion as to Uwell's design philosophy comes in the comparison to Times Infinity. Just the week before this video's release, Times Infinity got a big update, but my script only touches on the earlier version of the game. Either way, I'm about to give an overall personal interpretation, and thus I spoil significant parts. So I'll point out it still doesn't cost very much money. Times Infinity is weird, even more so than Studio System. Half of it can be described as a visual novel, and you might remember I indicated it was a shooter, but there's also multiple platforming levels, a quiz section, and a series of random minigames that go on for a significant amount of time. It starts to feel so unfocused and lacking clear indication of intent that it leaves you uncertain on what the vision was meant to be for most of its runtime. But it does eventually deliver what I interpret as a straightforward explanation of theme, at the end of a vignette locked behind the absolute gut check the game labels bonus challenges. One of these bonus challenges includes a segment which is definitely the most difficult and frustrating task in the whole game, and arguably as hard as anything in Studio System, even pre-patch. This might sound like misguided or questionable pacing, but I think it's bold and intentional that you, the player, and Para, the protagonist, only understand the nature and purpose of your struggle at the very end. In short, she was given a special test at the hands of 3 recurring characters, in part due to her lacking a major. My own personal interpretation of this is that the game intends to simulate directionlessness because the protagonist lacks direction in life. Boiling it all down to a single word is probably the most egregious oversimplification I'm going to do in this video. I think the game has multiple ideas, and the feeling it instills are very complex, but for the sake of discussion, we'll say it's about a lack of direction. And in my mind, this contextualizes everything, from the structure itself to every little detail and gimmick. The fact that the story is, or it appears to be, a series of loosely connected vignettes, that the gameplay veers off into so many tangents, that the art style itself is so loose yet busy at the same time, and the general implacably dreamlike atmosphere. It's all to capture the feeling and experience of being adrift in life. Which is to say, every element is organized around the theme. And even though half of Times Infinity is a visual novel, I'd say it's clear that Uwell puts a high value on the gameplay. From my explanation earlier, the most concrete manifestation of the game's intended vibes is communicated through the experience of play. I probably wouldn't have understood the theme without the literal text, but I would probably overlook the text itself if I didn't feel the intended emotions by playing the game. And because the text is locked behind the aforementioned extremely hard bonus challenge content, Times Infinity demands the player display a decently high level of skill and commitment. Just from a surface level, there are ways in which Studio System resembles Times Infinity. For example, Studio System has an epilogue locked behind getting an S rank in every bonus challenge, and you have to go on a whole New Game Plus quest to unlock those in the first place. But I would argue this epilogue is much less important to Studio System than the final vignette is to Times Infinity. And all that is a product of the difference in theme and approach of the two games. In a word, Times Infinity conveys its themes from the through line of various elements, or lack thereof. whereas Studio System is, in a way, conveying its theme in every individual moment. There's more of a focus or consistency, which Times Infinity inherently can't have since that would go against the entire point. I don't want to disparage the game for this, as the execution is admirable, but it's understandable why Studio System would be much easier to approach, enjoy, and replay for most people. It is still a case in Studio System that every element is organized around the core themes, that the gameplay is arguably the most straightforward vector through which the themes communicated, and the most revelatory textual content is gated behind the player displaying adequate mechanical mastery. But due to that difference in themes and intention, Studio System's display of mechanical mastery happens throughout almost all of the main game, and arguably over more than a single playthrough. All of that is due to the pact system. Shortly after exiting the tutorial room, you'll end up facing a gigantic metallic godlike entity who forces you into a divine pact. Here you can choose one of 3 clubs. The exact mechanics of this only become clear later down the line, but to put it simply, from now on there's a number in the code which starts very high, but it ticks down for every moment of unpaused gameplay. The speed of its decay is determined based on which club you pick. You can also bring the number back up by doing whatever task is assigned to the club you've chosen. At certain thresholds, the pact health will display as divine with a blue indicator, good with a yellow indicator, or broken with a red indicator. The health of your pact in the final area will determine what ending you receive, and will also be displayed on your scorecard at the end. Basically, you're graded and scored on how well you play. Your pact health will be really high if you just get to the end quickly, but obviously you couldn't speedrun the game on your first playthrough even if you wanted. Therefore, you'll have to try to restore pact health as you go along, and the unique conditions of each individual pact will provide some variation of a challenge that creates an additional burden of time and resource management. The weight of a soft timer is something that really colors the whole experience. Every single moment has an added tension to it because every second the pact is dying. There's an interesting conflict regarding the aforementioned evocative imagery and interesting details, because although you want to get a move on, the game presents a motivation to stop, look around, and try and understand what you're seeing. A lot of what are otherwise completely safe rooms containing traditional puzzles have a greater element of fear and frustration to them, at least relative to most other survival horror games I can think of, where the puzzle sections typically only test a different mental faculty than the main gameplay, or if there is some element of danger involved, the puzzle is often made easier to compensate. Not so in Studio System. One of my favorite puzzles is the one where you have to determine a code by inspecting various milk cartons around a room. The compounding stress of the timer, the sound of random footsteps, and the sheer amount of ultimately irrelevant information makes what is, in the end, a simple puzzle turn into a memorable detour. This puzzle in particular relies to a significant extent on inspecting things and understanding the layout of the room, so there is an incentive to not just wait in the pause menu to work out the solution in your mind. Speaking of which, a much more obvious example of a time sink would be what I'll call the movement puzzles. As mentioned before, Becky can stand on things that you move with the fixed camera, and the game sometimes turns this interaction into a fixture of a major set piece. These sections have also drawn some criticism, and I feel like this is sort of just a different version of the tank controls discussion from earlier. A lot of people regard something unconventional as flawed or clunky, when really it's a matter of cultivating skill. The platforms move in a bit of a floaty way, and they don't drag Becky with them, so you have to be conscientious of her position and movement on a given platform, but pretty much everything is consistent. The only jank is the imprecision of the human body. The reason why I call it a puzzle in the first place is because getting through is less a matter of precise execution, and more a matter of testing things out and understanding how it all works and how to get through. You can technically get through a lot of these sections by effectively brute force dog walking Becky to the end, but that's a tactic so awkward and difficult it's on the level of a speedrun strategy. I would chiefly credit that difficulty to sections with camera changes, though these are usually demarcated by solid platforms, and if you're actually playing as intended, the camera position generally won't screw you over. So it's mostly a matter of the player needing to learn the game before they try that. You can't really die during these sections, as falling only resets your position in the room. So if anything, that makes the consequences of failure sting even harder. Any mistake is effectively a permanent time loss for your run. This gets underscored by the fact that the first big traversal section in the game comes after a significant chunk of gameplay and cutscene, and right before a new save point. The player is encouraged to lock in their progress as well as the time wasted on mistakes. The resource management only gets more complicated when it comes to combat and how that interacts with the different clubs. It's a bit hard to talk about because, like I said, everything connects to everything else, but I'll start with the basics of combat. Shooting enemies in this game is overpowered. In a normal shooter, what generally makes the act of shooting difficult is the variance of your position relative to the enemy, the movement of the enemy itself, and the speed of coordination required to maintain target, which may be exacerbated by everything else. Even a shooter where aiming is the primary primary or only challenge will generally have any test of speed or accuracy be very strict to keep things reasonably difficult. But in Studio System, the enemies move fairly slowly and steadily to match the pace and capabilities of Becky, and the fixed camera tilt is not only fast enough but stable enough to keep up with them. Aside from inexperience, panic, or changing camera angles, shooting an enemy should be fairly trivial. On top of that, it's really strong. Shooting the body of an enemy deals slightly less damage than the melee attack, but aiming for the head deals slightly more, and it's effective at any range. There's very little lag or recoil between shots, so you can keep firing away if one hit doesn't finish the job. The game balances this not by attaching more complicated systems, but mostly just by the scarcity of ammo. I'll go over later how the bosses in particular contribute to this, but you won't have enough ammo to deal with every single enemy you come across, and a significant chunk of the ammo you can find requires at least a bit of work exploring. This is especially the case on hard mode, where basically all the ammo that easy mode puts right in plain view of the main path is removed. Movable objects are also a limited resource, so the most reliable option you'll have, should you want to preserve ammo, is your melee weapon. The bat is basically your safety net to deal damage if you don't have anything else, though there are parts of the game where you won't even have a bat. When you do obtain the bat, the game lays out a subtle tutorial that allows you to understand that the two biggest factors are timing and spacing. You can't spam the attack because enemies hit you slightly faster, and your hitbox only extends a bit in front of you. Actually beating an enemy to death requires getting into a rhythm, which can easily be made more or less difficult depending on enemy health, its position on the stage, how much room you have, the camera angle, and whatever else. In the original demo, you could basically just spam the bat without consequence, effectively invalidating the shooting, so I find this a clever bit of rebalancing. It reminds me of how in Resident Evil HD there's this relatively advanced move you can do where you bait out a grab from a zombie and step back just enough. That way it's trapped in end lag while you can just run by. It's a bit hard to pull off in that game, but it's essentially the basis of effective combat in Studio System. Now, I find it much easier to maneuver with Becky than Jill, but it's still complicated enough that you probably won't master it on your first run through. I feel that the challenge modes really highlight the intricacies of the combat system in a way the normal game doesn't necessarily require from the player. That's in part because avoiding enemies is often the optimal strategy in the main game, but you won't know if it's better to run or stand your ground, or even how best to run away from an enemy, until you're more experienced with the game, and often attempting to run past something will only put you in more danger. But there's another complicating feature to combat. The bat has its own durability system. It doesn't break or become unusable, but if it gets too dirty, you can't restore your packed health, no matter what you do. And the only way to clean your bat is to use the same healing items that restore Becky's health, putting a drain on your own survivability. This is what I mean when I say that enemies should often be avoided. Ammo and packed health are both extremely valuable resources, so you might not want to fight an enemy. However, you have to be good at dodging, or else you'll be eating into health pills either way. This is why I think the clubs are absolutely genius. The Execution Club is the most straightforward in the dilemma it presents. Kill enemies to restore packed health. This pact will all but force you to engage with enemies regularly, which forces a drain on your resources over the course of the game. Despite Execution having the slowest decay, I've seen people take it and end up being unable to heal their pact from how much they end up fighting, which feels like a perfect encapsulation of the challenge. Photography Club relies on a similar calculation of resource management and combat management, with a different trade-off. Taking a picture of an enemy means giving up ammo without dealing any damage. Since this pact has the quickest decay, you'll want to be taking pictures as often as possible, which will give you less ammo, which means almost every enemy encounter will either have you avoiding the foe or exclusively using your bat. This is balanced by the fact that taking a photo restores a decent amount of packed health, but it means that most combat encounters will be more difficult as opposed to Execution Club, where theoretically it's a more beneficial trade-off. Both of these clubs force you off the most optimal path in order to balance your packed health and other resources, and it can be really hard on your first playthrough. I consider myself a person with a good amount of horror game experience, and my first playthrough with Photography Club left me on ending Y. My friend, who is a bit of a hardcore gamer, did Execution Club and got ending R. One way in which I think the game might be better served is if it was a bit more clear that you can, cough, reasonably expect to get one of the lesser endings in your first playthrough. The difficulty of the game seems to be a sticking point for a lot of critics, and I must admit before I replayed it myself it seemed like a daunting task, but I do think that if people just went through the game again instead of reviewing it after one go, a lot of their frustrations would fade away. This is a game that takes after good old Silent Hill and classic Resident Evil after all. You're meant to replay it over and over again. Regarding the thesis I laid out at the beginning of this section, I believe, and I'll see another personal interpretation disclaimer, that self-improvement is a major theme of this game. You can probably catch on to this through the narrative allusions to it and the focus on Becky as the protagonist, but the pack system puts the idea to the forefront. The experience I went through led me not to succeed on my first try, so I had to get better at the game to improve myself skill, as it were, to achieve the best ending. It almost feels redundant to say that every moment of this game is about this, because, well, basically every game can be said to be about improving skill, but that just goes to show that the medium of a skill-based video game is well suited for conveying the intended theme in this regard. I say intended very assumptively, of course. I should note that my experience is not universal. The truth is, ending B has been achieved by more players than any other, by a significant margin. And while I can assume that at least some part of that is the fact it would be the most coveted for a second playthrough, it seems likely to me that a significant chunk of players got it on their first run. From asking around and making my friends play the game, I've actually seen this in action. I am, of course, speaking from the biased perspective of being this game's #1 fan, but I imagine that getting the best ending on your first playthrough puts less of an emphasis on the idea of long-term struggle for improvement. If anything, someone who goes through that is much more likely to be left waiting in place for their packed health to go down to the last save point, so that they can achieve the other endings, which feels completely at odds with what I think is the point of the system. Instead of struggling for a better outcome, you're standing around deliberately aiming for a worse outcome. I don't want to linger too long on this, because theoretically this is something that could be alleviated in a patch, though I imagine it would be difficult to balance properly, even having thousands of players as data points, because the game can make it pretty tough to just get from one checkpoint to the next. Optimal play on the macro level is really just a matter of proficient play in the micro level, strung together over the entire game, and having to reset a few times can lead to varying levels of efficiency, depending on how skilled or fortunate the player just happens to be. I should mention that in the first couple months of its release, the difficulty of certain sections was tuned down a bit in response to the frustrations of some critics. And I appreciate these changes, especially considering most are technically optional, and I also see the potential in easing the difficulty a bit to get players to lock in progress with less optimization, but that doesn't seem to have had much of an effect on it. There's two big things I worry about regarding the balance, one of which is the club I haven't yet mentioned, which I feel to be blatantly the best option. The Friendship Club does not directly interact with the combat, which doesn't make that portion of the game any more difficult. It does require exploration, which does make it compete directly with time, which is the most important resource, but it's not too hard to find a few phones, with a couple of them being literally right on your main path. It was also patched to restore packed health when you pick up items, which is almost absurdly busted, especially considering how abundant items are in normal mode. This also means that Friendship is the best option if you want a high score, as you can save as many resources as you want and still restore packed health, all without too much expenditure. Execution will eventually take held health, and Photography will necessarily take held ammo. But Friendship just takes time, and often less time than it takes to earn more back in return. Balancing this club would probably necessitate increasing the amount of phones while decreasing their health return. That way, at least before you've completely figured out the game, you have to spend more time exploring to keep things at a good level. I feel like that's a lot to demand, though, considering every phone has a unique conversation. However, that brings me to my next point. Mechanics aside, Friendship is the only club that contains unique content, with the phone calls providing additional bits of dialogue. Nothing too major, but there's no equivalent in the other clubs, making Friendship just objectively the best option. Giving the other two clubs something that's fitting for their respective subjects, different from one another, and at least nearly as interesting as the Friendship phone calls would be a difficult task. Those are all very subjective criteria, but the best alternative would mean making Friendship a more punishing pact, so the phone calls are a reward for the challenge, which the developer seems to have deliberately tried to avoid with patches. Outside of the individual clubs, and assuming there won't be any massive changes to the length or structure of the game, the most obvious option for balancing the game would be adjusting the pact decay, making the skill floor a bit higher with sheer numbers. This is also a bit of a tough call, because even a little bit more pact decay would mean nerfing the single biggest contributor to overall score. Any score runner would refuse to update, chasing the highest possible score, even if it means avoiding the latest version of the game. Then you have a sort of whack-a-mole type situation where you might compensate by doing something like rewarding the player for not saving as often, or buffing the points for killing enemies, which, by the way, feels weirdly low. It's something that can eat into every other resource and score metric without any proportional benefits. But I mean, it is survival horror, so it does do its job by incentivizing you to avoid the enemy. But the bonus mode challenges are all dedicated to testing your combat proficiencies, so it's not as if the game only puts value on strategic avoidance. That bit aside, I do appreciate the scoring system. It gives the player a natural incentive to replay and get better at the game even after they've seen all the unique content it has to offer. The different metrics and the restoration of the slowly draining timer that is pack decay not only tests the player on all different skill sets, but means that at high level play, a score run is distinct from a speedrun. All this quibbling on how to both increase the likelihood of first time players getting a bad ending while optimizing the fun of high level play doesn't really detract from the fact that when I played the game, it worked for me. My first few playthroughs gave me the structure, challenge, and incentives that made the narrative hit as hard as it could, drilling the theme directly into my skull, and the mechanics kept bringing me back to play again in various score runs. This is a sub 6-hour game with a sub 3-hour replay where I've managed to clock in over 50 hours in less than a year. I will admit, on pretty much every replay I've discovered some new detail or interaction that I've never seen before, but like, this isn't the kind of playtime extension you can get from novelty alone. This is effective longevity derived from the quality of gameplay mechanics, of solid fundamentals. Not that the premise and fundamentals are the only things worthy of praise here. There's actually a lot of little different things the game introduces, often very short challenge sections and then drops. I can appreciate this stuff. There's a flowerhead enemy type that only appears for one room, blue webbing blocking a door you have to shoot through that only appears in one room, and perspective changing white orbs that only appear in 2 rooms. The first being an introduction, the second feeling like almost a boss fight for the concept of aiming and the toughest test of speed and accuracy in the whole game. It's really hard to do on a controller. And there's also, the actual boss fights, the 2 pinnacles of challenge and variety. Now, I'm of 2 minds when it comes to the bosses. On one hand, I can appreciate that they are effective in their job they exist to fulfill. I'd say they borrow squarely from the classic Silent Hill design school, chiefly serving as important cogs in the greater machine of resource management. Because most enemies aren't strictly necessary to fight and shooting is so overpowered, if you were able to simply waltz from the beginning to the end of the game avoiding as many enemies as possible, then your ammo stockpile would invert the difficulty curve. So the bosses are made to drain your resources, particularly your ammo. Each boss is an absolute damage sponge, taking over a baker's dozen hits, and they're only weak to bullets, so you can't melee them. It wasn't until my 5th playthrough that I even held more than 10 rounds of ammo, and that was in normal mode. So I feel it's safe to say that your initial experience in your hard mode score runs will hit a bump against these 2, at least until you've achieved a higher level of play. What bothers me a bit is that their approach to being an ammo gate is very blunt. Among the games that inspired Studio's system, although not all of them are necessarily built or balanced around a melee-only playstyle, it's still feasible to face off against bosses with whatever tools you so desire. What typically motivates the player to unload their ammo is not just the danger and consequence of failure, but also the breadth of the combat system. I understand that because Studio's system doesn't have that breadth of arsenal, the game has limited methods to encourage player behavior, but it feels a bit unsatisfying for interactions with what are supposedly special enemies to be relatively limited. It's so limited that both bosses have a mechanic where they will spawn orange ammo containers in the middle of the room, giving you 4 rounds to kill them off if you're completely out of it. This is a necessity because otherwise you could softlock yourself, but it feels particularly awkward that this is an integral element of the boss design. There is an obvious missed opportunity in the fact that there's no boss that requires you to use the grab. I'm not sure if I can say there's even a grand major encounter near the end that serves as the ultimate grab challenge. It feels easy to imagine something like a boss with body parts you have to grab out of the way and then hit a weak spot with a bat, although that's probably incredibly ambitious, easier said than done. So for something maybe simpler, let's say you're in a small room and you have to complete an eye-moving puzzle under a time limit. While this is happening, normal enemies will occasionally pop in from either side of the room to distract you, requiring you to either divert your attention from the main goal or to multitask. Maybe there's a way to slow down the entrance of these enemies too, like doors you can shut temporarily, so you don't exclusively have to fight them. Right there you have a unique, stressful, difficult encounter that builds on the existing mechanics of the game while retaining their depth. And this could feasibly be built on code and assets that are already featured in the game. As it stands, I'd say these bosses feel like they could be from any classic survival horror game, which isn't exactly an insult, but it's below the standard set by the rest of Studio's system. I think the Tomoro boss is probably the weaker of the 2, design-wise. When I talk about the story later, I'm going to have a lot to say about how interesting everything about Tomoro is, but as a boss fight, not so much. Every time I play, it takes a few tries to avoid getting hit, because aside from her 2 quite large and sudden attacks, she has randomly spawning object hitboxes. It can be easy to avoid these attacks by simply staying outside her range, but if you're in her range, it's extremely difficult. I appreciate that the game makes a challenge out of it by putting the respawning ammo right next to her, on top of this metallic goo that slows you down. Still, that would make for a bit of an easy encounter, so as you deal more damage, the arena itself launches large blocks that randomly appear from the walls to damage you, turning the game into a bullet hell for a minute or so. It can feel a bit random because there's no real telegraph for when and where the blocks will come out, but since they have a limited range of directions and locations and run on a predictable cycle, you can avoid damage if you do things quickly and think proactively. It's a little bit of a clusterfuck, and in that way, it does its job of also draining your health, but it can be a bit rough to reset here on a score run. It's cool that the ground texture is just some guy, I guess. Shadow Becky is a lot better, at least. I would compare this fight to the missionary boss from Silent Hill 3, a decently agile humanoid enemy that mostly just runs by and takes pot shots at you. But instead of a brawl in an open area, you're forced into a lot of thin, winding corridors. This makes it harder to avoid the melee attack by circling around her, and also turns it into a frantic navigational challenge. There's very few bosses in any game who can match up to the sheer terror of running from Shadow Becky for so long and suddenly seeing her pop up from somewhere you didn't expect. And in that regard, I'd say it does its job well. I do have to admit, considering the metallic sheen the large bladed weapon weapon and the clear connection to the main character, my initial assumption with Shadow Becky was that she might be some vague Pyramid Head homage. This assumption caused me to consider that she might play like Pyramid Head, and I made the second assumption that fighting her was pointless and I had to either survive or escape. The presence of ammunition throughout the arena probably should have tipped me off, but her health pool was so immense that I began to doubt if any amount would put her down. On top of that, Shadow Becky is different from every other enemy in the game in that she does not bleed, the otherwise universal indicator of damage being dealt, whether it be to monster or machine. Shadow Becky kinda just lifts her arm. It's a bit weird. The game is generous enough to put a save point right before her though, so there's no harm in seeing if loads of damage will do her in. But it's likely the player will not have enough ammo to defeat her on their first run, even after collecting all they can find in the labyrinth. This is where the anti-soft lock orange ammo comes in, but also a bit of a design hiccup. In the previous boss fight, you're going to see that spawn in and immediately understand because you're so confined into one tiny little room. It'll always be visible. But since Shadow Becky chases you down a complex network of corridors, you can easily have a moment where you're halfway down a hallway with no ammo thinking, so what the fuck do I do now? There is a bit of possibly unintentional confusion and desperation the player has to endure here that I think highlights the misguided approach of making it so you have to shoot the bosses. Then again, the thought of melee combat against Shadow Becky is horrifying. I just know I'd be resetting here forever on a score run. However, once you get the orange ammo to spawn, it's much safer and faster to just stay in the middle and take quick shots whenever the boss shows up. I imagine the intent was that you'd run in and quickly run out, but since that's unoptimal, the spirit of the fight is broken in that you're encouraged to stay in one spot. But honestly, I think that's fine. You'll only be at this point once you really understand how the fight works, and if you're at such a high level, then the atmosphere and spirit of the game will almost inevitably take a hit as you absolutely just plow through it. And nothing's better for a high level player than just being able to absolutely decimate an encounter. On the subject of bosses, there's also this chainsaw monster you might encounter right near the end of the game, or a unique enemy encounter, maybe you could call him a mini-boss. It has a weirdly significant presence showing up in the background a couple times beforehand as if it's watching you, but the only real confrontation with the thing is short-lived. It has a half dozen hit points and you fight it in a room where you get a freshly cleaned bat, 4 free ammo, and 3 big grabbable bookshelves. It can kill you with one hit, but it has a pretty generous wind-up, and you have all these tools to avoid engaging the enemy from close range. This makes it not too dangerous and quite easy to kill. Honestly, a bit of an anticlimax. Alright, I've talked about everything that isn't the game's writing for as long as they possibly can. I want to once again restate the initial disclaimer, that I am not the arbiter of meaning. I don't want to have to re-explain the events and details of the story more than once, so I'm going to be mixing my appraisal and critique alongside parts of my subjective interpretations. I do feel that some explanation of meaning is necessary because I think a significant part of the value of the narrative comes from the depth of literary analysis, but do remember my take is not the singular ultimate perspective of the story, and I'll try to word what I say carefully and hope you all are discerning enough in that regard. Before I get into specific interpretation though, I just want to say that the writing in this game is extremely high quality. It is appalling to me that so many reviewers complained about the prose or the plot, as if they're aspects you just have to look past in order to enjoy the game. There's such a clear proficiency in fundamentals, I just feel like the people who said this didn't even bother to try understanding it. First of all, I think the narrative is well integrated with everything else. Aside from all the wordless visual storytelling and how the theme of self-improvement is conveyed through gameplay, I think the format of exploration and puzzle solving does well to prompt the player to observe and think about the setting, to read the scattered papers in case they're a path to progress. Even in the text meant to straightforwardly serve as a guide to a puzzle, you might find a piece of history or symbolism that furthers your understanding of the world and characters. As you internalize the text to gain a better understanding of the challenge, so too will your image of the story solidify. There's a lot of value, even outside of the visual novel style cutscenes, and within them even more to appreciate. A lot of the dialogue comes across as fairly naturalistic. Even the confident Tomura trails off into awkward tangents and variable pace and detail in a way that mimics a realistic pattern of human speech, not to mention the frequent fragmented lines or pauses from Becky. I feel like in many games I've played, it's fairly easy to predict when a character is about to respond to ellipses, but for Becky I never got that feeling. Jasmine has a noticeably different speaking pattern from the others, clear, straightforward, and with a very even or controlled pace. While not outside the bounds of reality for a particularly talented speaker, her charisma is preemptively justified by Becky in her first appearance. The prose allows for every scene to establish its tone effectively. Tomura's lighthearted personality makes the early scenes with her amusing or relatively calming, while the serious disposition of Jasmine gives more of a weight to her explanations. The way characters jump from conversation topics manages to maintain a healthy flow that doesn't make anything jump out as particularly distracting. But all this almost hides the sheer efficiency in conveyance. Any attempt to cover the story in a generally linear order or in any amount of detail will be baffled by the sheer density of information packed into every dialogue exchange. For example, take this one scene that plays when you talk to Tomura in school. In just 12 lines, this conversation features a subtle commentary on Tomura's role in the story, foreshadowing of the narrative mechanics of NB, and the first of many textual connections made between the 3 main characters and the 3 primary colors. This is all contained within the otherwise innocuous natural dialogue that just seems to be telling you a joke or two. It doesn't feel like the game is bombarding you with supporting information. I think this makes the game all the more replayable, that every time you look back at something you can discover new meaning or a connection you didn't notice. I haven't just been replaying the game to score run or speedrun, I've been doing basically casual playthroughs to look at and interact with anything I didn't notice before. But this conversation with Tomoro is also a good showing that the game is not unfocused or arbitrarily elaborate. The second part of the conversation, although a bit longer than the first, contains much less density and detail. This, I believe, is because the subject matter is one of the major points of the game, the pressure that Tomoro exerts on Becky. There is an incredibly subtle reference made to an important puzzle in the middle of the game, but for the most part, the game is allowing the more central idea room to breathe. Finally, this conversation transitions into the main plot by having Jasmine show up and list off all the chemicals that could be in the drinking fountain, which is a reference to an incredibly similar joke in Times Affinity. But if you, like me, didn't know that going in, it still functions as a joke on its own. Now, that was a lot I had to say about a relatively short cutscene that most players probably won't put much thought into. If I went on in this much detail about every cutscene in the game, this video would be like another whole hour long. So I'm going to take a more holistic approach in summarizing how the writing style evolves over the course of the game. In the beginning, the conversation topics and their hidden meanings are mostly prospective, referencing things like Becky's potential future, or their plans for the rest of the day, or more subtly, the events and structure of the story that will unfold. As the game goes on, a lot of it becomes in-the-moment reaction or observation as Becky comes to understand the bizarre situation she's in. The retrospection is relegated to a small handful of scenes, chiefly the major moments of exposition. I can imagine that a lot of the confusion over the story comes from people who witnessed something bizarre, went, "Oh, what the fuck just happened?" and then didn't get an answer because the characters did not address it in detail from that point on. It's not the kind of game where characters will just re-explain the entire plot for the convenience of someone who wasn't paying attention. It's not that there are no answers, it's just that it takes effort. You have to remember things, make connections, or replay the game with those later events in mind. And I think that's a good thing, even if it means the game is abrasive to people who don't want to put in the effort. I think that's a good thing, especially if it means the game is abrasive to people who don't want to put in the effort. I also think that the game grounding itself in the present allows the emotional moments to have a grander weight to them. You don't get distracted by detachment or thoughts of the theoretical. When the story wants to focus on an idea or a feeling, it does so perfectly. It brings together the effective visual design, evocative soundtrack, and mechanical integration to justify the writing of the story, the information it wants to convey. Even if the big picture plot might elude a first-time player, the individual scenes can carry their own weight as comprehensible and logical conversations. And almost every gameplay segment has the context of a simple or understandable goal. Go to school, check out the abandoned film studio, find Tomoro in the courtyard, get food for Tomoro, etc. All of these goals are defined, actionable, and generally justifiable for Becky, so you almost always know what you're doing and why you're doing it. The few moments where I'd say the motivation is weak or ill-defined are often supplemented by an amazing set piece or extremely tight level design, something that at least moves the player forward. A lot of the momentum comes from the rising and falling action, which the game balances by having a bit of a 3-act structure. The classification of this game into distinct segments is by no means official, but I'm going to use this terminology just to make the process of talking about the story easier for myself. I can at least justify myself by saying that the demo versions very tangibly feature this structure, where they literally center around 3 keys and 3 doors. And in the full game, you can mentally mark sections of the game based on what character they focus on and where the major moments are positioned. After the prologue, I would say that Act 1 concerns Tomoro. Becky starts looking around for her friends, the first bit of direction she's given is a note from Tomoro, and everything she does from then until the boss fight against Tomoro follows neatly from there. Act 3 also feels easy to define. After the second boss fight, Becky is given the narrative goal of running after Jasmine, and everything she does from then on, going even into the endings, comes about as a natural result of that quest. Act 2 feels a bit looser because Becky starts off with one goal and then just sort of wanders aimlessly until she finds Wendigo. And while that section of the game does feel like a real structured quest, after that it's a bit more aimless wandering until the boss. And while the Tomoro boss naturally flowed from the previous material, the relation between Shadow, Becky, and Wendigo is a bit more hazy. You can fairly divide the different acts of the game based on the boss fights, and in that sense the structure does have definition, but I do feel that the intermediary point between Acts 1 and 2 feels like a weak bit of connective tissue, even accepting that the attempt of a 3-act structure is something I completely made up on my own. Backtracking to the first area and doing the milk carton puzzle is actually fine, I kinda like it, though I can imagine to those inclined to complain it could be a contributing factor of frustration. When you get told to go to the gym, you go to the gym and nothing is there. From this point until Wendigo, you're basically just moving forward aimlessly. It's not helped that the maze, while an interesting pace breaker, isn't a very good challenge. It's either extremely frustrating to wander without direction, or extremely boring to just go the same way 3 times in a row. Throwing an enemy or two in there could have helped to give a mildly tense chase, or maybe to direct the player on the right path. I can imagine the developer thought this segment might have been a bit too unconventional, and thus it needed a tried and true level format to keep the player on board, and there was nothing more tried and true than the elevator hallway. This is one of the 3 levels which originally appeared in the 2021 demo, all of which were later altered and carried into the 2023 demo, and later the full game. The demo level 3 was the most significantly changed in all versions, with only 2 rooms and a vague idea of a grab puzzle shared between them all. Even the hub area from the 2023 demo made it into the full game. However, it's now just a randomly elaborate room you walk through only one time on your way to tackle level 3, and then level 2 in an unchangeably linear order, with level 1, as mentioned, being all the way back before the middle of the game. It's quite possible that the original plan in development was always to have these sections split apart in the full game to wherever they best fit, and level 1 being relatively grounded may not have gelled well with the reality falling apart vibe later in the game. My personal hypothesis that these 3 would have been paired together but were split apart may not represent reality. I'm just making an assumption here. Regardless, I think keeping all these levels together, and especially turning the demo hub into a place to return to, would have been better from the perspective of structure and pacing. For one thing, the presence of the elevator hallway only extends the awkward distance between major story moments, which could have been alleviated if there was only one distinct level you have to go through during. Were it only the maze, perhaps I'd be saying that the aimless feeling of not knowing where to go perfectly matches the eluding design, but because there's a whole other traditional level right before it, such an argument would fall flat. Act 2 is already a pretty long section of the game as it is, while Act 3 is short even if you count the endings as part of it. Balancing out the 2 isn't strictly necessary, but it might have improved the flow a bit better. It definitely would have helped what was, on release, perhaps the most frustrating area of the game, Demo Level 3. This section has a room that was very heavily nerfed due to the various contributing factors of difficulty and precision and variability. And I must admit, as someone who played it unpatched, it was very stressful to do this knowing I was under a time limit. You could also get soft-locked if you were bad. I bring this up not to immortalize the mistakes of the past, but to praise the developer for amending what I'm sure must have been very complicated coding so quickly. That sort of skill and receptiveness is commendable in its own right, as well as the delicate hand required to ensure that the room still remains decently challenging. But I also think that the frustration over this section might have been mildly mitigated if I could have gone off and played the other levels. That's how I kept my cool during the hardest bonus challenge in Times Infinity, after all. No. I also feel that the uniqueness of returning to the demo hub after 3 levels would have given this final act of the story a bit more breadth. Tomorrow's quest has a lot of little optional places you can check out. Wendigo's quest gives you an option of 2 levels that are themselves on par with the complexity of the one in Tomorrow's quest. So it would make sense that the next act of the game builds upon that with a selection of 3 levels. But instead it's just a few well-refined levels in a row, mostly with content literally foundational to the design of the game, which isn't quite as fitting with the aforementioned reality is falling apart vibe. As it stands, the most solid and defined portion of the game for both the pacing of gameplay and structure of narrative is definitely Act 1, and I gotta say, the quality of writing absolutely matches that. Maybe that's an odd thing to say, considering this portion of the story is mostly focused on the one character who is surely the least relevant to the overall plot. But I have a lot to say about Tomorrow, or at least the shapeshifter pretending to be Tomorrow. Fake Tomorrow integrates into pretty much everything so thoroughly that I've been absolutely struggling to appraise the game in what were supposed to be the spoiler-light sections of the video. I fucking love this character. There's an almost stream of consciousness feeling to these scenes with the fake Tomorrow, her behavior and speech patterns being so weird that it's clear something is wrong, but we keep pressing forward. If you pay attention to her portrait, you'll notice that the fake Tomorrow has visible fangs even when her mouth is closed, and no freckles, a design detail that was specifically mentioned earlier in a way that, in retrospect, clearly foreshadowed this character design. There is a steady escalation of the bizarre that goes even beyond Tomorrow luring Becky into a trap and having her wander in the mirror world for a while. This reaches its absolute zenith when fake Tomorrow finally reveals herself in a very abstract depiction of shapeshifting through distorted character and glitching UI, with a unique transition directly into her boss fight that's meant to catch you off guard. Now, if you play the 2023 demo with the knowledge that the first act of the game centers around a fake Tomorrow, you can identify the signals that the demo's Tomorrow is the fake Tomorrow. There are a lot of differences between the 2023 demo and the full game, but the characters all have roughly the same personality as their final iteration. The one exception would be Demo Tomorrow, who seems to much more closely match the fake Tomorrow than the real Tomorrow. There's a few things that imply she's some sort of imposter, like the fact that she's the only one who can't naturally return to the hub room, or that she has the most extreme reaction to teleporting. The demo also ends with her killing Wendigo and Jasmine, then seemingly being punished for it. And, yeah, Fake Tomura would murder people, real Tomura probably would not. I have considered that maybe the plan for Tomura would just change drastically during development, but there's a line from Wendigo that no character acknowledges, which I believe serves as undeniable evidence. She refers to Tomura in quotation marks, as if the person she's talking about is not really Tomura. I bring all this up because I think it shows how important fake Tomura must be to the game. Not only was she a part of it so early on, but she had a much bigger role than even the real Tomura. The same is true of the full game. The real Tomura has a few conversations with Becky, mostly at the start, but she is absent for most of the game and has basically no knowledge of anything going on. Wendigo and Jasmine remain not just active in the plot, but also extremely knowledgeable, and Becky is literally the main character, so in that way, Tomura sticks out even more. My take is that Tomura is meant to serve as a symbol for some of the important concepts in the story that Becky grapples with, specifically the pressure to fit into normal society, emblemized through the epitome of modest success and normality that is Tomura. The fake Tomura, then, is a sort of exaggeration, or perhaps a deconstruction of the real Tomura from Becky's perspective. Real Tomura is generally upbeat in contrast to her downer friends, but isn't immune to awkward moments or insults. But the fake Tomura retains a chillingly cheerful attitude, even in this confusing, terrifying situation, much to Becky's chagrin. The real Tomura might pull a joke or anecdote out of nowhere to lighten the mood, but the fake Tomura treats everything like a joke. Where the real Tomura is a bit insensitive with the pressure she puts on Becky, fake Tomura seems completely uncaring toward her, and even Jasmine. Becky seems to think of the real Tomura as a bit pushy in how she keeps bringing up their future, something which Becky clearly doesn't care about. The fake Tomura builds on this by demanding that Becky get her food, something which Becky sees as a waste of time. But Becky obliges regardless. Just like how she continues to talk to Tomura and how she stepped into her car in the beginning. The way that Becky feels about Tomura's genuine concern and reasonable desires have been twisted into needless cruelty and pointless desire. I think it's also fair to interpret fake Tomura not as entirely a product of Becky's perception, but perhaps as a manifestation of Tomura's Jungian shadow. Since every trait of the fake Tomura is a negative exaggeration of the real Tomura, they may both stem from the same unconscious or deliberately repressed feelings. I think this may even be true in-universe, as the existence of the fake Tomura, and probably the hallway full of Tomura clones, is probably because of the aura adoption hypothesis, meaning the other world likely literally draws upon the personalities and minds of the characters. I also think Tomura represents more than just external pressure. She alludes to having undergone development that Becky could emulate, and the particulars of that are never quite made clear, but I think it's interesting that fake Tomura is a shapeshifter. You could say she literally has to change herself to be accepted by others, that her true self is unpalatable. Perhaps the most poignant lingering effect that the fake Tomura has on Becky is in conveying this idea, even if it probably wasn't her main goal. She probably didn't want to get shot 15 times. I think you could say that Tomura is both victim and perpetrator regarding conformity, but at the same time, both versions of her seem outwardly upbeat. And there's not a lot to imply it's entirely a facade. I sort of prefer to imagine that she is at least mostly satisfied with who she is as a person, because I think it grants the game a fair bit of nuance to admit that there are many people who live content with themselves in a way that the protagonist is not. Regardless, I'm sure you can see why I said the room beyond well fits the emotional state of the moment. Right after the fight, you do the only bit of backtracking in the entire game, going back through the elevator and pool area to the main school. There's a lot of odd little changes, threatening text on a door, the store logo changing, the now defaced 2 Yell poster, and the shattered body of the Divine God. After all these details, you see the first real area of the game is now darker, almost bereft of enemies, except for one that ambushes you in a single room. It is extremely fitting that, immediately after the Tomura boss, you return to something familiar, only to discover it changed for the worse. That poster actually leads into another motif regarding the fake Tomura. It originally said, "What's consuming Tomura yellows?" Later on, Wendigo describes the false god is wanting to consume Becky, and half the time you spend in this part of the game is looking for convenience store food because the fake Tomura is hungry. Maybe her hunger represents impulsive desire, reflecting her apparently selfish or inconsiderate behavior. Though if we connect hunger and consumption to the motif of changing oneself to fit in, we can say that the process of that change is being equated to being eaten, getting chewed up for the benefit of the consumer. There was actually another allusion to consumption that would have taken place in this part of the game, but the scene was removed both for a worry of its reception and and the workload it would have required. I do think it's good to evaluate your own art, have some discernment as to if a given element is necessary or beneficial, but I believe in this example that self-critique was too restrictive. The absence of this moment is palpable, and I think this would have been a valuable inclusion. As I said in a previous video, I can appreciate a tasteful mixture of horror and sexuality. Not to say that every game needs this kind of thing, but this whole section of the game is an expression of the fake Tomoro's unpredictable and forceful personality. The nuance is an expression of the idea of conformity and change. And this in particular would have shown Becky's conflicted feelings towards Tomoro taken to the extreme. It would also add the complexity of whether these actions come from the shapeshifter alone, or if they're meant to reflect the feelings of either the real Tomoro or Becky or both. And if that was the case, one could easily imagine how their sexuality connects to the aforementioned concepts of conformity. You could say that it's still possible to interpret this in the base game. Becky seems almost infatuated with Jasmine, but it's hard to argue the game really explores this vector for the theme any more thoroughly than potential reference. But at least that's not as far as the hunger symbolism goes in the game, if we don't limit ourselves to the first third of the runtime. There's a puzzle in around the midpoint where Tomoro is described as following the flow, and there's a reference made to the 789 joke, once again highlighting conformity and consumption. She's given the association of the lucky number 7 primarily because she's employed by the fictional convenience store chain 7 & Sons. I think that the corporate imagery might be another piece of the puzzle to the various motifs surrounding Tomoro. I definitely believe that you're meant to feel somewhat uncomfortable about 7 & Sons. Or at least I'm sure the inside of the store isn't just a cheeky reference to the original Silent Hill given a unique visual quirk for fun. I feel that Becky is uncomfortable about the idea of working there, and Jasmine says that the food is unhealthy. It's sort of mundane, but I think it's really easy to fit a corporation into the ideas of consumption, not in the typical sense that a customer will consume a product, but in the sense that working for one is a spiritually draining experience. In the process of having a real job, you're also expected to conform to further standards of behavior, to speak and smile on the job. Other things I'm sure would stress Becky out. Interestingly, Tomoro isn't just an employee, she's the manager. A position of control. It's such an odd detail for a high schooler that it makes me wonder if it connects to how every character wants to exert their influence on Becky. It's a bit of an understated idea, so I feel like I might be reaching a bit, but there's something evocative about the suffocating visual design that I can't shake. Nor can I discount how, once the fake Tomoro is defeated, the logo of 7 & Sons is completely replaced, as if the two symbols were tied together. At the very least, the change in number feels like a succinct way to segue into the second segment of the story. If I were to define the subject of Act 2, I would say it is elaboration of Becky primarily through characters intended to serve as reflections of and elements meant to symbolize her. This can almost get lost in the overwhelming amount of information presented to the player at this point. Even small details connect meaning back to Becky, with the ever-reliable number puzzle saying that she's number 8. Although Studio System doesn't seem to ascribe any particular meaning to that number, we can perhaps infer meaning from the fact that Becky wears it on her chest as an infinity symbol. In fact, at the beginning of Times Infinity, a character makes this same connection and says that therefore the number 8 indicates infinite potential. That's not to say that the association must be true in both games, but it's an interpretation I quite like. It sort of paints an ambiguous light on the fact that the 7 & Sons logo changes to 8 silent weapons. I guess an obvious view is that Becky has overcome the fake Tomoro, but the silent weapon part feels a bit sinister. But of course, the most important example of Act 2's purpose comes in the character of Wendigo. The fact that she's meant to be a parallel of Becky may not be immediately obvious to the player, at least not until she literally says they're quite similar in the end. But in retrospect, you can see these subtle signs of their similarity. Becky is an artist and Wendigo is a writer, both creative pursuits. Wendigo's color is pink, a pale tint of red, and later on it's revealed that just as Becky was a nickname for Rebecca, Wendigo Solus is just a pen name. Her real name is Lisa. The connection itself is logical, but the purpose of that connection isn't clear right now. I will say, I think this part of the story has a bit less clarity of purpose in comparison to Act 1. I could basically explain all of the meaning behind Tomoro and her interaction with Becky without needing to dive too far into the rest of the game. But here in the middle, we haven't seen the full extent of what Wendigo and Becky are meant to represent, what roles they are to fulfill. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as much as you could say that an arc focusing on them would be better served later on in the story where the feedback for major questions would come more immediately. I feel that it's fine to have mystery and intrigue in the middle, and thankfully Wendigo isn't the only point of intrigue or source of meaning we can draw from. There are various notes around the apartment level left by who I believe to be a high school age boy working under a woman just 2 years older than him, who he calls Ms. X. They have a bit of a complicated dynamic. Although there's a bit of resentment, the boy nonetheless obeys her command. At first it seems out of obligation, then because Ms. X is directly manipulating him, but later notes seem to imply he's developed a bit of an obsession with Ms. X. Perhaps because, according to the boy, Ms. X seems to be the only sociable person around. Whatever the reason, based on the repeated "I am a good boy" text, it seems he's accepted his role. In the room just below that text, you find a monster who initially seems passive towards the player. It moves towards a button on the wall that raises the platform, allowing Becky to escape the pool in the middle. You are forced to kill this monster to progress from here, as it drops a key card you need to open a door later. It also emerges from a room with a note that seems to be written by the same author as all the others, the high school boy. I believe this implies that the monster in question was the boy. This wouldn't be the first time the game indicates the students turn into the monsters. You can find evidence in the very first area, which initially features the corpse of a girl which disappears halfway through, only for an enemy to spawn in her exact location. There's also a bit of text in an optional room which reads, "The more blood you lose, the more you become like them." Not exactly ambiguous there. This is clearly something recognized by the characters in-universe, as not only is there a discussion of moving dead bodies here in the second act, but you can also find a poster explaining the blood retention suits, which are presumably the bodysuits worn by the characters. You might be able to piece together that Wendigo and Jasmine know more than they let on, since Wendigo arrived on the scene wearing one, and Jasmine made Becky and Tomura wear them. Despite this, Becky and the others seem to frequently get nosebleeds and pass out, which implies that even with protection, existing within the mirror world is unsafe. We could reasonably assume that the high school boy was wearing a blood retention suit, but still fell victim to overexposure. I do find it interesting that when Wendigo is talking about the password, rather than forget, she uses the phrase "lose the ability to recall," which sounds much more severe and unnatural. If the mirror world does cause significant neurological damage, this could also explain why the high school boy seems to lose his mind. Perhaps before he transformed, he was already out of his mind, though obviously there is evidence of his humanity and desire existing after the transformation. On that note, this might also be the reason why Pact Health is constantly draining, that whatever mental or physical drain the world has would also apply to magical or spiritual things and whatnot. Either way, I think this little side story about the boy serves a dual purpose. One is that, although we can understand in the abstract the terror of the mirror world turning students into monsters, giving the story of a specific character to serve as an example makes it a bit more emotionally evocative. It is shocking to read these notes coming from some indeterminate time in the past, suddenly grounded with the existing form of the boy in a bespoke cutscene. The tragedy of it that the characters who survive the story might not go through, especially with how long the boy might have been like this, can really sink in. As well, the terrible practices of Turner and Campbell are made tangible through our witness of even just a single victim. I also think that the high school boy and Ms. X can be read as a parallel for Becky and Wendigo, an older woman who issues commands to a high schooler who does resent her for a bit, but eventually forms a bond, despite the fact that the woman is clearly a manipulator. It's also funny to note that the game specifically avoids mentioning her real last name. There are just enough details present at this point that you can possibly surmise this Ms. X and Wendigo are the same person, which makes the parallel between the boy and Becky a lot more direct. Either way, I think this part of the story is meant to reflect on the moral character of Wendigo, but also the path that Becky might fall down if she continues to fall victim to manipulation, which I'll talk more about later, especially since she seems to fall for dangerous women easily. On another note, I've noticed that the game draws a lot of attention to clothes in this section. Aside from the fact that the clothes the characters wear establish the color symbolism, and for Becky and Tomura the associated number symbolism, the game has now also clarified that they're all wearing very important blood retention suits. The game did make mention of the outfits in the beginning, particularly in the fact that neither Becky nor Tomura seem to like wearing them. I would say it feels quite meaningful, having to wear clothes you'd rather not in order to avoid death or injury, and in the end, still being at risk. My immediate read on it was that it mirrors common marginalized experiences, perhaps reinforced by the fact that, as the game points out, Becky's attire is also worn by a depressed-looking girl on a film poster, likening her to a literal, reluctant actor. The poster in question is actually yet another elaboration of Becky, which is fairly obvious just from looking at it, though it's probably the most esoteric of them all, relating much more to the symbology of acting in film that's prevalent throughout the game. A bit later on, the game states that life imitates art and vice versa, which not only ties into the overall plot, but is related to a number of concepts and details. The whole apartment area is apparently a recreation of A Trip to the Past, and the numbers puzzle I keep mentioning makes reference to Jackie, which are both fictional movies in the world of Studio System. But if the numbers puzzle hint is to be understood as diegetic, it would mean that the details which perfectly map onto Becky, Tomura, and Jasmine featured in a movie made well over a decade before the game is set. I see both of these as elaborations on that idea. Art can not only directly influence what people do in reality, but there also seems to be an almost cosmic force where fictional ideas become real. This is a game largely about things which circumstantially resemble or intentionally copy other things. We saw that earlier with the fake Tomoro, and this segment continues that motif by also having a boss that resembles one of the main characters. Shadow Becky is perhaps the most enigmatic element of this entire game. She isn't really addressed by the narrative at all, she just sort of comes out of nowhere and dies just as quickly. Shadow Becky isn't even her real name. I just have nothing else to call her. Maybe Metal Becky, or Red Becky, Corrupted Becky? The closest I can grasp to a Watsonian explanation for her existence would be it's either the false god taking form to consume Becky, a product of Becky's own aura that appears as only a single mindless silhouette, which would I assume is due to her being much more reserved than Tomura with her dozens of copies, or perhaps a combination of both? It's possible that this isn't even really happening, that Becky is just making it up in her head and it doesn't get brought up again because it's all fake. I mean, she brings up the events of Act 1. You'd imagine an encounter like this would also be in her mind. I can't say for sure though. I think I have a better grasp on the associated motifs though. Similarly to how the symbolism around Tomoro and fake Tomoro connected to a family of concepts including consumption and conformity, I think a lot of the symbolism around Becky and Shadow Becky connect to a family of concepts chiefly expressed through the word collapse. Collapse comes up 4 times in the whole game. Once before both boss fights, once during the explanation of wilting trees, and one final time just after this fight when Becky attacks Jasmine in a blind rage. The final example is an odd one, but perhaps the most blatant. The narration text says, "I've lost all hope, collapse, collapse," and then Jasmine tells Becky to stop before she lets herself bleed out. The former line connects the concept of collapse with giving up, while the latter implies that her violent outburst is somehow self-destructive. Though, I feel the connection with death and collapse is just as obvious when we consider that the fake Tomoro says it right before telling Becky to die, and then putting the player into a dangerous boss fight. The explanation of wilting trees also just says the red-colored one has given up. It is wilted the most, content to collapse into a sea of dirt. Which, yeah, also very straightforward. I think it's clear that collapse is used to represent the concept of simply giving up and dying. Becky's lack of desire to move forward in life, her depression and defeatism. It's a sort of acceptance of collapse. Therefore, Shadow Becky represents a form of self-destruction, a figure resembling Becky that exists only to attack her. And hey, what better way could a video game represent the desire to give up than making you fight yourself in order to move forward? When I put it that way, Shadow Becky herself sounds fairly simple, and although it's true that I don't have as much to say about her as I do for the fake Tomoro, I still think she's quite important for elucidating information on the real Becky and her associated symbolism. You could say if you've gotten a red-colored broken pact, the game assumes you've basically given up on trying to maintain it, which might be true depending on how you achieve it, but I think it gets the idea across regardless. Aside from the placement of bosses, I think that the structure is defined in part because the conversation with Jasmine that happens shortly after the Shadow Becky fight marks a major turning point in terms of understanding the broader plot. So the spark for everything was Gerald Campbell proposing the aura adoption hypothesis, a widely ridiculed work which turns out is completely true and explains everything about the mirror world. His son, Mike Campbell, sought to prove his father's work, though a lot of that effort was lost alongside the life of his daughter when the arsonist burned everything. After the film studio Blue Fair was shut down due to an accidental death during production of their unreleased unnamed film, their assets and IP were bought up by Turner and Campbell Group, clearly headed by Mike Campbell, where they continued researching the mirror world. There's some bits about a transit project present in-game through the non-Euclidean space where the same door can take you to wildly different places, and how the federal government is apparently involved, but most relevantly, it seems West Companion High School was built on top of the film studio. We can tell some students were selected as laborers, but from the sheer amount of dead bodies, we might also surmise that they served a dual purpose as subjects or sacrifices for the project. The real goal of the project is to use the mechanism of life-imitating art, and the divine act of creation itself, to manufacture a false god, a mirror to an actual god. For Turner and Campbell Group to harness the unimaginable power of the manufactured false god, it must inhabit a host, a human body. Wendigo explained earlier that the fake Tomura was a manifestation of the false god, seeking Becky as a vessel to be born, and we can assume the same was true of Shadow Becky. We may also surmise that the godlike entity encountered at the beginning of the game is apparently a literal divine god, the being that the false god is meant to mirror. There's footage from an early version of the game where this entity calls itself Meteos, but I'll assume that's dubiously canon at best, and just refer to it by a more generic title. I think it's clear regardless that this divine god opposes the will of the false god, and they're both sort of using Becky as a proxy, cultivating their power through her, as if she is uniquely suited as a tool to disrupt their conflict. Finally, Jasmine Campbell, daughter of Gerald Campbell, helped to awaken the false god by leading Becky here and making her the sacrifice. The language used by Wendigo and Jasmine to describe the false god is that it is awakened, but not yet born, an apparently important distinction. Although Becky is clearly special in the battle between gods, one of the endings will directly show that she's not the only one who can serve as host. It almost definitely isn't the case that the false god can use literally anyone as a host, as I'm not exactly sure why there wouldn't have been anyone among the dozens of victims or surviving associates of Turner and Campbell group who could have been a viable host. If I'm right about that, then this likely means that the false god was not manifesting and attempting to filter itself through a vessel before the events of the game. Even now, it seems like it can only fully come out and attack in the deepest and most bizarre parts of the mirror world. Also worth noting that the different forms have very little, if any, physical connection. Either the false god is taking possession of existing bodies, or it is manifesting forms from thin air. Either way, it would imply that it can exist as a sort of invisible, intangible spirit, in a word. All the speculation on the technical aspect aside, the important takeaway is that there is no way to really concentrate or control it before the events of the game. After this explanation, Jasmine takes the bat and runs off, in some unclear attempt to settle things herself. Becky's only stated goal is to catch up with her, and that's how it goes from now until the endings. Although there's a few in-engine scenes where Becky catches back up with Tomoro and Wendigo, this cutscene in the beginning is the only cutscene from now until the end. I do think that gives Act 3 a bit too brisk of a pace. Aside from the aforementioned structural issues of it being shorter and more linear, Acts 1 and 2 had information spread out a bit more, like a breadcrumb trail of motivation. There are a few problems I had at this time, the first of which being that, with all this information in front of me, I worried the game could just end now. In some horror games, particularly of the Silent Hill lineage, the birth of a god is a plot point so significant that it's been used as both a narrative climax and thematic center point in and of itself. I know now that there was more to it than this, but outside of an encounter with the final boss, I wasn't sure what else I could be expecting as a mystery or answer. Knowing what I do now, I applaud just how much the final sections expanded my understanding of the work, but I think there should have been a bit more going on around here. And I think what might have worked for me is if the levels on the way to Jasmine were bookended by more information about Jasmine. Firstly, as you'll see, most of what I'll bring up regarding her symbolism is going to be from Acts 1 and 2. We don't get too much on her here, and I feel like that would help to give this part of the game a stronger feeling of progression and solidity. Secondly, I mentioned earlier that the second act was a bit cryptic, and I will say the symbolism around Jasmine is also pretty hard to determine, even with full context. She is probably the one character I'm the least certain about, where I'm the most worried about the logic of my interpretations. I've already said I don't think that the middle act is necessarily bad for the delayed answers, but I do wonder if perhaps this penultimate section of the game would have assured the less generous critics that they are approaching a greater understanding of the symbolism characters if we just got a few more breadcrumbs about Jasmine throughout. In regards to the range of concepts associated with Jasmine, the reason why I find it the most confusing of all is perhaps because it feels like the most broad. If we look at the pack system, the blue color signifies high health, good performance, skill, and self-improvement from a gameplay perspective. But it's hard to say these things narratively apply to Jasmine. I mean, she's a borderline delinquent addicted to cigarettes. Not exactly the bastion of high health, good performance, and self-improvement, right? Well, perhaps we could say this is encompassed under the banner of goals and direction. After all, the blue wilting tree that represents Jasmine apparently wilts in a specific, deliberate way, just as the player will struggle to achieve a particular outcome. The odd thing is, though, within the main game, Jasmine has arguably the most unclear motivations of any main character. Part of this comes in the fact that she seems to be the only one interested in the wish-granting false god, putting a focus more on the mechanism to achieve the goal rather than the reasoning behind it. Considering she seems a bit sad about having to go through with it, that makes it even more a question of why she does all this. But I think there is an answer, even if Jasmine doesn't explicitly say it herself. If we, for the final time, check the number puzzle, we see that Jasmine is associated with the number 9. Funny enough, if we look again at times infinity, the same character who connected 8 with infinity says there's nothing special about the number 9. And the context of this is that a character named Jasmine, spelled with a Z, joins the group. So ironically, you might believe there's something special about the number beyond it being just a reference. But the hint comes in the method for ascertaining the number, the amount of siblings. Rather than just being a roundabout way of saying that J is the 9th letter of the alphabet, there's plenty of proof that Jasmine actually does have 9 sisters. If you remember the milk carton puzzle, you'd know that Mike's daughter was named Audrey. There's also a fun secret area that allows you to skip the entire apartment level in Act 2, where we can observe 4 distorted portraits alluding to 4 members of the Campbell family, whose first initials all begin with sequential letters of the alphabet from G to J. Alongside the mentions of Mike and Gerald Campbell, this is a lot of focus to put on her relatives, which is to say, I believe she's not doing all this for herself, she's doing it for her family, and not in the vague sense of she has her family in mind. I don't imagine that she's particularly happy about having to betray and endanger her friends. Considering she laments her situation but speaks as if she thinks it is inevitable, it would seem that her obligation to family compels her to achieve the work of her father and grandfather. Maybe that's a bit of a leap, but I think this allusion to filial piety aids in the social commentary studio system wishes to convey. The pressure of society isn't just conveyed by a well-meaning suggestion of a friend, or in the words of a complete stranger, or from the inadequacy evoked by comparison to more successful peers. It can be something you are literally raised into, that you can't imagine not going through with. It's sort of an interesting contrast against the fake Tomura, who selfishly acted according to her own desires, even if it hurt others. In Jasmine's case, she's putting aside her own desires, even if it hurts her friends and herself. So that's my take on it. The ideas surrounding Jasmine include a direction and conviction to achieve goals, achievement through struggle, connection, bonds, and attachment, but also burden, restriction, obligation, sacrifice, and a suppression of the true self. It's really hard to encompass all of this in just a few words, which is perhaps why it's the most difficult to pin down in the first place. I don't have anything snappy like hunger or collapse. The most difficulty I have is squaring the character of Jasmine with the game mechanics of the pact system leading into the ending. Again, this is subjective interpretation, but I think most can agree that Blue is good. Not an uncomplicated good, but still clearly better than the others. But from a certain perspective, Jasmine is the least good of the main characters. She conforms to power just like Tomura, and engages in self-destructive behavior just like Becky. While you could say that perhaps the two types of Blue are meant to be understood as separate, I personally prefer to imagine it as simply being a concept broad enough to encompass both. One way of looking at it is if red is giving up and yellow is taking the easy path, in this case conformity, then blue is taking the hard path. This could extend to cultivating skill, distinctly going against the whims of broader society, or accepting a path of hardships. But something being hard does not necessarily mean it's good, and Jasmine is an upfront exploration of how exactly that can be twisted. The fact that Jasmine is the one who takes away the bat does make it possible to argue there is some connection between her character and the mechanics when it comes to conveying the general meaning of associated symbolism. I've seen a lot of players get a corrupted bat at some point around the apartment level, and by taking it away, although the individual levels do become more difficult, the player is given an opportunity to restore their pact without first needing to acquire healing items. This allows the player the chance to make a late game comeback, and the short-term difficulty will result in more optimal play being locked in. Basically, Jasmine forces you on the hard path to help you improve. At least, that would be quite fitting, if intentional. I can't discount that it's a matter of game balance, as the 2023 demo made it optional to pick up the bat, and you could get even more points at the end for it. So the developer obviously knew that these sections could be reasonably completed without it. So these levels can be used to sort of control the flow of difficulty based on their placement and the conditions around them. In this case, you get one level in the middle with the bat, and the two other near the end without. So there's an escalation of difficulty across the game. I do appreciate that the developer got use of this quirk in the demo, because I'm not sure if having the choice between taking the bat or not would have worked out in the full game. There's some sections, particularly right after you get the bat for the first time, that feel designed to showcase its advantages in comparison to either shooting or running. If we imagine a version of these encounters where the camera and positioning still made shooting difficult, and the walkways were too narrow to run around them without killing them over some distance, that might still be doable, but not only would it probably be more frustrating, it would lose part of its purpose as a test for the player to specifically use part of their toolset. And I assume the balance of difficulty is why you find the bat once again, but then only get to use it for essentially a single room before losing it again. This happens in the encounter with the chainsaw monster, who appears right before the final save point. The only really notable thing about this monster that I haven't gone over is the fact that it drops a high-level keycard that allows you to progress. It just so happens that this keycard clearly belongs to Mike Campbell. Now, it's not as if holding a keycard means you are its rightful owner, but the fact that the head of Turner and Campbell had apparently turned into a barely sentient monster would explain why the project was apparently slow going for a while then. And I do think this is a fairly neat way to wrap up the story of the most important character in the background of the main events, without having to ever introduce him as a character. A player might wonder, hey, what's to stop Mike Campbell from trying to prove his father right in some other way that leads to further destruction? Or even if he's given up on that, he's clearly endangered, indoctrinated, and probably psychologically damaged, at the very least Jasmine, and quite likely his other daughters as well. So what will come of that? And the answer the game gives is that, well, you killed him so hard that he exploded, so we don't need to worry about him. With one of the big picture antagonists taken care of, the overall plot and stakes established, and Becky getting to once again see Tomura, Wendigo, and the corpse of the divine god, I'd say the game does a pretty good job leading into its climax. Once you enter this room with a gondola, your pact disappears from the menu, and the ending you'll get is already determined. This coming after the first real test of a fairly new gimmick makes it all the more surprising. You don't get the opportunity to realize exactly when it's coming, and then dunk all you can into getting your score back up. It arrives abruptly and right after a safe point of no return. The endings diverge a bit, but one thing they all have in common is getting to play as Becky in her eclipsed state. You play as her in first-person mode, unable to aim and walk at the same time. The pause menu also looks a bit different. I didn't want to spoil it at the very beginning of the video, but I feel like this moment is an absolutely genius direction to take a game where the fixed camera gives the player a sense of security, something which I must repeat I can't say about any other game. A point-of-view camera actually gives a more limited field of view than someone with two functioning eyeballs would have in reality, along with a lack of proprioception. The shift in perspective alongside the overbearing darkness of the area here emphasizes that much of your ability to observe your surroundings to keep an eye on any threat has been taken from you. On top of that, alongside your speed being affected by the waterlogged rooms, you can no longer walk in aim mode, not only hampering but also separating your combat, observation, and traversal. This not only highlights the advantages of the normal system, it also makes the limitations forced onto you here all the more terrifying. At the end of the game, when you might finally feel you've adequately adjusted yourself to the mechanics, the game changes them to make you feel as vulnerable as it possibly can. I imagine a likely inspiration for this is Silent Hill 4: The Room, though a bit inverted. In that game, the dangerous dungeons are presented with a third-person camera, but the safe room where Harry Townsend can restore health and save progress has been switched to a first-person perspective. The former puts a sort of dreamlike distance to the locations, while the latter makes it seem more involved and a bit cozy. One is danger, the other is safety. The camera feels like a relatively minor thing in that game, just a good use of shifting perspective in a way well suited to an interactive medium. But the concept feels even more interesting here in Studio System, where the camera is a much more important element. It really helps establish that this is the finale, more so than the packed system basically telling you as much. For all the other little gimmicks the game might pull out, changing the camera signals that things really are at the end. As mentioned, you have 3 different pact-based endings achievable on a first playthrough, and the bonus alternative that you can get only on New Game Plus. In line with the intention for you to go through multiple playthroughs, the quality and emotional tone of the pact-based endings generally align with game performance regarding pact health. Ending R for a broken pact basically prematurely cuts the final segment, putting you into a single room that leads into an ending cutscene. There are some moments in this game that just completely defy any sort of logical breakdown, where it completely sets itself to surreal horror with almost unmatched scale and creativity. I don't need to say that it evokes a primal dread being forced to walk towards this unidentifiable object the game calls a blood moon while the enemy sound screams at you and the image distorts itself. It just goes without saying. The end cutscene then promptly declares that the entire school blew up, leaving no survivors and no explanation for what happened or why. The matter-of-fact tone and almost gleeful disposition of the reporter gives the scene an eerie feeling, like more is wrong with the world than just the destruction of the school. And the best part is that the interact text is red, meaning you can't see the word against the red background. You wouldn't even know it's supposed to be there unless or until you've gotten another ending. I doubt anyone will get stuck here, but it's almost like a final little joke played on you for fucking up so bad. It might seem rough that the player can end up with such an unsatisfying conclusion after braving through the whole game, but I consider it a bold choice. If the player was ever going to replay, this is all the more encouragement. If they weren't, well, they can easily infer this a better ending, so it's not the best idea to judge it on the worst outcome. Ending Y arguably is that better ending, and I believe an outcome the player has a similar likelihood of achieving as ending R. Instead of just shoving you in the final room, the player has to go through a waterlogged maze-like area where they have to find a couple of buttons to progress. Unlike the cave maze in the middle of the game, this one is a lot easier to get through once you know the solution, as you basically just have to go down 2 corridors. On your first visit though, it's absolutely disorienting, a section that fittingly compounds the terror of the camera shift. This ends with Becky arriving back in a normal-looking area, with a moment that might jump scare the player when a door actually opens. Here you're funneled into a short section where Tomoro asks you to help fight another fake Tomoro. The game depicts this cutscene without the portraits, making it impossible to tell if this Tomoro is the real one, giving a bit of uncertainty to the rest of this ending. The player must do a repeat boss fight against fake Tomoro in a similar arena, but you're given a lot of resources beforehand. And even with the limitation of first person, I feel it's not that difficult to overcome. This fight follows up on a small detail you can observe after the first fight with fake Tomoro, where Becky is unsure if it came in from or escaped using the vent. But I think it's a bit of a Schrodinger situation. If you do get ending Y, then the answer is she escaped. But if you don't, you're probably not meant to imagine she's just wandering around all fine somewhere. If ending R is bold in how it might upset the player who achieves it as their first conclusion, ending Y is bold in that it actually feels like a relatively serviceable conclusion to the game. It has the most forwardly hopeful presentation of all the endings. There's also a very subtle undertone of something being not quite right, with the status of Jasmine being ominously unconfirmed and the identity of Tomoro left as a lingering question. question. But it seems like the protagonist has reached the end of her character arc. She's happy, she's out of danger. Ending Y does provide some important context for ending B, but it doesn't feel as if it's basically directing you towards achieving it. I can say that I didn't go back to the game for almost 2 months after this, admittedly in part due to working on other projects. It was with the assurance of the other harder to obtain endings that I felt compelled. The first I went for then was Ending A, the one you can only get after you've completed the game once. This is another one of the techniques the game pulls to encourage you to replay. There's no save file, so it's not like you just reload to a certain point to try and only do half the game or something. And to make it a bit of a sweeter deal, the game has a bunch of grabbable medallions scattered about that either give you some bonus content or progress towards its ending. Grab just 6 of the 9 available red medallions, and you'll get the alternative ending. There's one final red medal hanging below the gondola, allowing a player who has already collected 5 to get their final one, giving them access to this alternative ending. On my second playthrough, I strategically grabbed exactly 5 before this point so that I could get both Ending B and Ending A, simply by reloading my save file. In fact, with high packed health, 5 medals, and a willingness to wait, you can do every ending from the save point before the spike wall, but that will require game knowledge, skill, preparation, at least one replay, so I consider it more a matter of convenience than a way to exploit the system. With such an obscure condition to access it, I sort of assumed that Ending A must be the most true, complete, lore-heavy, happiest outcome of them all. But it was probably wise to consider it similar to the joke endings you'll find in a Silent Hill game. Exclusive to New Game Plus and a bit difficult to obtain, but not the most serious affair. More just an excuse to encourage the player to go through the game again. Ending A is actually almost as short as Ending R, and primarily focuses on a depiction of the characters 13 years later in an alternate timeline where the events of the game never happened. It has a short vignette of Becky working at a diner with Jasmine showing up and making her play a rudimentary minigame that you, the player, actually control. The design of Becky at age 31 made for some of Uwill's most popular works of art on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. Uwill was reticent at the time to speak on if this version of her would feature in the game, probably because it would spoil part of the unreleased game's plot. It's also possible to interpret this as genuine uncertainty. Considering how disconnected it is from the rest of the game, it's feasible that this ending was not fully figured out at this point. Regardless of my uninformed speculation, I have to applaud the talent to present an alternate universe that entirely removes the plot of the game, and still managing to not just make it good, but also something with mechanical and thematic purpose. On the gameplay side, if you are attempting to either score run or speedrun the game, you'll want to go through as quickly as possible, avoiding pact decay. However, having a divine pact gives you Ending B, which not only has the longest one, but also wipes your ammo, decreasing the score ceiling and making the run longer. Instead, just by acquiring some red medals on the way, the speedrunners won't have to worry about pact management and can just get the shortest ending, while the score runners can go for both the highest packed health and held ammo. Furthermore, since this ending will be the main choice of speedrunners if this game is ever shown off to an unfamiliar audience, they won't be exposed without context to the incredible moments of Ending B. I'm not positive that this last bit was a conscious consideration, though I think it'd be cool regardless, and it would make sense to the fact that it presents a vignette that is superficially unrelated to the rest of the story. Now obviously I don't think it's entirely unrelated. It just might not be obvious at first that this is reinforcing a central theme. If we return to the motifs I mentioned earlier, we could say that Ending B represents improvement, that Ending Y represents neutral or negative change, and that Ending R represents a total collapse, all of which sounds right so far. If that is the case, then I'd say Ending A is a fourth conclusion, representing stagnation. Here, there was no catalyst for Becky to drastically develop. There was no catastrophic tragedy. But there is an obvious theme of mundane failure. Becky and Jasmine are stuck in boring, normal jobs that they don't much like. And although outside the text itself, Tomura at this age would have been a 5-time Wimbledon attendee, but notably never a winner. In that way, this ending taps into a different horror than the rest of the game, when presented in a much more grounded setting. The fear that you'll get older without accomplishing much. If we believe that each ending is vaguely tied to a character, and with the other color associations being obvious, then by process of elimination, Ending A would belong to Wendigo. The fact that Becky here is around the same age as Wendigo in the main game only strengthens the parallel, and I think clarifies Wendigo as a representation of stagnation and failure. And considering how her last appearance before the ending had her alluding to some plan which wasn't fully explained in any of the other endings, there's a good setup for figuring out her goals in Ending B and seeing where things go from there. Ending B was the final one I got, around 2 months after the game came out. Having that break to reflect on it, giving it more of my time, and experiencing the numerous little updates already did a lot to improve my impression of the work. But this ending alone brought about what is perhaps the greatest shift in my opinion of the game. I want to annoyingly issue another spoiler warning, because I truly believe that just this portion of the game, by itself, is worth the whole price. Trust me. So, Ending B starts off with the same waterlogged area from Ending Y, but instead of Tomura waiting for you at the end of it, you find Jasmine. And instead of a gameplay segment, you end up in a short cutscene wherein Jasmine behaves in a suspicious manner before suddenly killing Becky. On normal mode, the following gameplay segment puts you into a little puzzle where you walk through doors corresponding with numbers, with the order indicated by a hint that cleverly reinforces the twist that was just revealed. In hard mode, and I believe in all modes of earlier patches, it's instead another maze section. Although there are no enemies, this one feels a lot harder than the waterlogged maze just before. It's a pretty big space, but you can't see more than 5 feet in front of you, the level is decently vertical, you can't move while in aim mode, you walk slowly, and everything looks the same. On top of that, there's a bunch of random light spots that are around that indicate literally nothing and are just there to distract you. From all the aimless wandering through sheer directional noise, the correct path will eventually be drilled into your brain through trauma. And even after you figure out the correct path, you have to keep walking for such a long time. I think it really helps the pacing that this was cut from normal mode. I imagine part of the idea was that this would be downtime in between big revelations for you to process what happened. But it's honestly a bit distracting, so it kinda has the opposite effect. The normal mode version serves the twist a bit better by just being so comparably unremarkable. When I replayed on hard mode, I didn't strongly recall this section at all, which honestly only makes it funnier to have encountered such an unfamiliar hellscape. Felt like I was being fucking trolled. Later, I realized it might be an intentional reference to the red maze in Yumeniki, which is also a torturous labyrinth associated with floating cubes and a slowly pulsating red texture. Yumeniki fans call this area hell, not just because of how it looks, but also because it's much more difficult to navigate than most areas. Along with there being no clear direction to follow, the walls prevent the player from combing the area by just looping around as they would almost anywhere else in the game. When I made this connection, I realized this area might literally be hell. After all, Jasmine just sacrificed Becky in some pursuit relating to the false god. Even if Becky isn't a sinful person, the nature of her death might condemn her all the same. And if we died, then it's only logical that the gameplay could only continue in the afterlife. I gotta admit, although the narrative beats are better served by this being a shorter intermission, the meaning of this area in and of itself is most clear in its frustrating original form. In that regard, having both is sort of the best compromise. At the end of hell, we find the divine god. Its broken body apparently indicated that it was also dead. But because the pact was at high health, it's able to bring Becky back to life and end her eclipsed state. We can infer that the divine god's power and agency is tied to the pact, meaning that in ending R, it was too weak to save the school from destruction. And in ending Y, it was only strong enough to prevent that distraction and thus did nothing more. No one could be brought back from hell. It's unclear if either Tomoro or Jasmine died in that route, but if they did, this would explain why they'd stay dead. Also, it's neat that the same text foreshadowing that the chainsaw monster can kill you in a single hit becomes a bit ironic in light of Becky returning to life after being killed. I've been skimming over it a bit, but since Jasmine attacked Becky, the game has been alluding to its ultimate twist, which it paints the full picture of in the following moments while the player reads newspaper clippings and watches a cutscene of the protagonist watching a recording on the television. Silent Hill reference. I think it's fair to say that this reveal is so huge, bringing to light so many bits and questions, that I'd basically have to bounce around the whole game with what gets explained or recontextualized. What's revealed here is that the whole time, the camera has been a separate character. The ghost of the cameraman who was killed during the production of the cancelled film mentioned at the beginning of the game. Someone named K. Cross. The strange presence that's been accompanying Becky, the text symbol that's been on all the narration and drawn on seemingly random parts of the environment, and even, probably, I assume, Kelly 19, the missing arsonist from a random puzzle in the middle of the game. The whole time, all of that has been one entity, Kelly Cross. Not only that, it's also revealed Kelly was killed by Lisa Cross, the lead actress of the various Blue Fair Studio films, the actual name of the mysterious Ms. X who worked alongside Turner and Campbell Group, and the true name of Wendigo Solace. A lot of things fit into place knowing all this. The death of the cameraman, mentioned so frequently and revealed to be historically important, might have seemed like an odd detail to receive such focus up until now, where it becomes crucial to the motivations and movements of several characters. Now it's clear the reason Wendigo got involved with Turner and Campbell, and presumably with the occult, was due to the desire to once again commune with Kelly, either through crossing worlds or getting Kelly to eclipse a living host. She presumably had contact with Jasmine and might have been the mystery benefactor alluded to at one point. Perhaps more importantly than the background lore, a lot of how the game is to be understood changes with the fact that Kelly was attached to Becky. Even the name of the game itself takes on a different meaning. Studio system is a compound word, but system in regards to polypsychism means a collection of identities within one body. Considering that Becky becomes host to not just her own mind, but also the soul of Kelly, the two together could be described as a system. You can do the same thing with Guardian Angel, since the divine god seems to refer to Kelly as Becky's guardian, but calls Becky Angel. So this is a game set in a studio where you play as a system comprised of a guardian and an angel. This is also a bit like yours. collection of identities, a bunch of shooting, it's possible inspiration. Think about it. It may not be correct to characterize this as similar to a system in real life, though. The mechanical dynamic of Kelly and Becky changes a lot throughout the game, so the first question I have regards the nature of the eclipse. Entering first-person mode and having the menu change from saying Becky's status to your status indicates the game is not only identifying this character as K-Cross, but also that K-Cross is the player character. K-Cross is you. But like, what does it actually mean to be eclipsed? It looks a bit like possession, but Becky seems to still be present and responsive, with the divine god even acknowledging the character who is allegedly K-Cross only as Becky. But Becky doesn't seem to notice or have a reaction to it, the only change being the crosses appearing on her eyes. We also don't see a massive personality shift in Becky, though this may be due to the fact that Kelly believed themselves to be Becky. I guess instead of one overtaking the other, it's more like a holistic fusion. The word eclipse could be loosely poetic, as in two bodies crossing over each other, or maybe it's an intentionally obfuscatory descriptor. More on the mechanics of this eclipse. Ending A shows the alternate Becky with crossed eyes, which implied that Kelly still eclipsed her, as if it would have happened regardless, so maybe it took longer since there was no catastrophe to strengthen their connection. Ending R has a bit of a weird depiction of the eclipse, despite Becky dying before actually saying anything, because the reporter has crossed eyes. I would have otherwise assumed the symbol was exclusive to K-Cross, but I don't imagine we're supposed to think that Kelly somehow jumped from Becky to this random reporter. Perhaps then this is just a general symbol that any spirit puts upon their eclipsed host. And excluding some elaborate backstory for this reporter in particular, I would guess this indicates the false god has wrought spiritual ruin upon the world, to the point even random people are falling victim to ghostly possession. Ending Y has the most complex depiction, and it also makes me question if the narration marked with the symbol of Kelly was actually entirely Kelly. Some of the descriptions, of course, only make sense coming from Kelly, but some of them are either extremely tactile or reference the history of Becky. I wonder if Kelly is deeply tied into Becky's brain, or perhaps it's possible that Kelly has genuinely been with Becky for that long. But that caused me to question the comments regarding the world losing its color only recently. Whenever this is brought up, it's either with Kelly's narration or when Kelly eclipses Becky, which indicates that it's Kelly who has this problem. My initial speculation was that her memories of color came from being alive, and that as a specter in the real world only loosely attached to a human, Kelly can no longer see color. But if Kelly's been with Becky for so long, then it developing as an issue is odd. However, what about Becky? Because the Steam page describes her as the one to whom the world has lost its color. I can't tell if this is intentionally deceptive or if it's indicating that it really is Becky who sees a colorless world. Maybe it's both Becky and Kelly? Maybe Kelly's influence caused them both to be like that, but uniting further broke it? Regardless of whatever mechanism can explain it, I prefer to believe that both Kelly and Becky see the world without color, because I feel like that keeps the intention of the visual metaphor intact. And either way, I think it's clear that the eclipse isn't entirely a good thing, stripping Kelly of the ability to have a concept of self, and taking away some of Becky's individuality and autonomy. In that sense, ending Y is repainted in a negative light, with Wendigo achieving her goal at the expense of both main characters undergoing a change that strips identity from them, or, in a word, makes them both conform to the will of another. The autonomy of Becky is further pulled into question from the fact that, as the game has been suggesting throughout this ending, Kelly is the player character. From the designation of your status upon the eclipsed Becky to the newly introduced player choice of dialogue options as prompts for K-Cross. The disconnect between the player and Becky is further elucidated as Becky figures out everything on her own, rejects the assistance of the player character, and then, in probably one of the best set-piece moments in any game I've seen, she moves forward throughout various rooms without any player input. During this segment, you can still move the camera, you can even pause the game to see a unique sprite of Becky facing away, but the movement keys and action buttons don't do anything. Honestly, my only complaint about this section is it could have gone on even longer, maybe thrown a vocal track over it so the player doesn't get bored. This isn't the first game I've seen weave the concept of player control or lack thereof into a narrative set piece. With the popularity of games like Deltarune, I'm sure I'm not alone. But I feel the moment captures the shock regardless by reserving it for a point so far in. And in my case, after I'd seen what the other endings had to offer. The idea that Becky can take control away from the player while effectively addressing Kelly Cross implies that the player was never really controlling Becky directly. Instead, Kelly was diegetically asserting influence over Becky, without either of them being consciously aware of this process. At least that's my understanding of it. It's almost difficult to describe the way the relationship between the player and the game changes at this point. Up to this point, the player has assumed the role of Becky. They gave her characterization through their mechanical choices. Becky's capability of maintaining the divine pact, which club she'd pick, her efficiency and strategy in this situation, all of these things are determined by the player's input. In turn, the design and narrative role of Becky gave definition to the player's motivations in action. When I talked about the game providing simple and understandable goals to guide the player forward, most of those were the motivations of Becky herself. Likewise, the player approached many of the gameplay challenges through the limitations of Becky's moveset. This is, in effect, how most video games work. The player and player character have a sort of mutual influence of role and characterization. In most games, though, this process never really stands out as something that even needs description. But Studio System brings that to the forefront in the fact that the real player character, Kelly Cross, was effectively doing the same thing the player was doing with Becky, except diegetically. Kelly was assuming the role of Becky, expressing agency through control of her and of physical objects in the world. Like player and player character, Kelly and Becky had mutual influence on each other. I think K. Cross is sort of the perfect player surrogate in some regards. Aside from bits of honestly inexplicable background information, which I'll discuss later, all of their characterization comes from the actions of the player, whether that be in gameplay as mentioned or in the dialogue choices. In order to even know what might or might not be Kelly's first name and appearance, you have to draw a fairly forgettable connection that the game never technically confirms. Until then, K. Cross is named after an ambiguous letter and a common symbol, with an appearance the player might never know. It's difficult to even say we know Kelly's gender. Although the arsonist image and description depict Kelly as a woman, if this is meant to be the same person, K. Cross is described as a cameraman, and the obituary text as well as dialogue from Lisa uses the gender-neutral they. If Kelly is the correct name, it's a unisex name, which doesn't give much away. Considering the conflict between the words of Kelly's very own sister and the presumably magical text of the mirror world, it's hard to determine which is more correct, or if there's even a contradiction as opposed to additionally enlightening context. But the effect this has on the player regardless is that unless they retain an encyclopedic knowledge of the setting, then they have to essentially imagine any identifying details about K. Cross, which may inevitably lead to some level of self-insertion. The player believes whatever they want to. And if I'm wrong in assuming that K. Cross is Kelly, then I'm basically doing exactly that. The characterization through complete character agency and lack of present identity makes the shift the player makes into the role of Kelly Cross feel almost seamless. You don't really question the state of being Kelly, you question the fact that you were never Becky, just like Kelly is doing. And despite the moments of foreshadowing you might have encountered before this, it's the kind of twist that feels almost impossible to predict. It's noteworthy that in the 2021 demo, Becky pretty much immediately acknowledged the presence of a guardian angel. The same is true of the 2023 demo, but there you can also tell from the narration that the angel in question isn't aware of being separate from Becky. I think the reason for this change over time is specifically for the moment of disconnection. The whole game has been about exploring Becky's alienation, how she is manipulated and betrayed by others. Just as the fake Tomoro sent her on a pointless quest, just as Wendigo and Jasmine have been manipulating her all along, the player character too was manipulating her, but rather than externally telling her to do something, Kelly was seemingly making her body move. That Becky is disgusted and angry in this moment does make sense, even if Kelly was good-natured and an ignorant participant. The game explores a lot regarding the integrity of identity and violation of autonomy. We are made to understand the feelings that Becky is going through here. Just as well, the player feels alienation from Becky herself, being defined as a separate entity from her, with the contrast of having literally walked a mile in her shoes. Part of the player's identity has been taken from them, in the same way that the characterization of Becky through her actions is taken away by the fact that they were not truly her own. It's honestly amazing that not only does this game play around with a brilliant mechanic that doesn't exist in anything else, it goes to every possible extreme, even forming its emotional nadir around the player's interaction. Though, this might seem weird to come only in ending B, which I earlier proposed was a matter of improving skill to achieve the best outcome. I think then that everything from Jasmine's betrayal to the disconnect of Becky and Kelly is meant as a dash of skepticism. It's as if it's saying you can't foolishly assume everything would work out immediately. Maybe it's communicating that genuine self-improvement will conflict with the whims of the world in a way that changing yourself to fit in won't, or that self-improvement alone isn't enough to fix all your problems. Perhaps in Becky's case in particular, there's the sting of her self-improvement being at the hand of another, meaning she can hardly claim that self-improvement as her own. But still, at this moment, she cries over her circumstances and cries out for her guardian angel to help. This moment, this display of distress and vulnerability from Becky feels so genuine and raw. I've seen the developer publicly express anxiety over the process of development for and the reception to Studia's system. I can tell that no part of this game is made from a place of cynicism or detachment. I'd imagine such a thing is inevitable, working on one project almost entirely by oneself for years. All art in some way draws from real experience, after all, and that probably extends to more than just the video games it will play. So when she's calling out for help from you, the player, it feels allegorical for real sentiment. Having the drive and desire for something but needing the help of someone else, that is basically the process of making art and putting it out in the world, hoping that something comes of it. You must put faith in other people to put their own faith in your work, their time, their money, their effort, all to experience the result of your money, your time, your effort. I would say that the view of Studio System as art commentary, if that wasn't already viable from its references to cinema generally, makes a bit more sense with the packed decay system and its endings. Becky already having something but needing to maintain it would be a very loose metaphor for her particular character struggle. But what if this pact represents an idea, a pristine vision of an artistic desire that will atrophy if no work is put into its creation? Thus, we have the various outcomes. 1. The art itself never comes to fruition, the project collapsing, lost, never to see the light of day. An obviously tragic outcome, but one where the wider public is never really exposed to the pain, where they never have a greater understanding. 2. The art is changed, a compromise made for it to see release, or to be accepted by an audience. Not the worst outcome, but unsatisfying from the perspective of the creator. Clearly, something is missing. 3. The art is fully realized. The struggle of its creation forms the work into its true, purest form. In a romantic sense, that's the ideal outcome, but to make a work not burdened by failure or compromise means that any judgment passed on to it is criticism of your true values and talent. It becomes difficult to distance yourself from negativity because you put so much of your soul into the work. It makes sense, then, that this is not just the only ending where we see Becky detached from external influence, but also the only time we see her cry. And then, as if building upon the metaphor of completion, Becky changes. This white outfit is called Peaceful on the bonus menu, but the files are labeled Hero Becky. Whatever name is more accurate, there's very clear symbolism at play, with the darkness of her uniform being dispelled for something brighter, and the red symbols associated with the abilities of the camera indicating the source of her power. The daisy, which was used to represent Becky on the map screen before, is a flower which symbolizes new beginnings and joy. The white daisy in particular can also symbolize innocence or purity, so you could say Becky was purified, reborn into a new form. A different comparison, one presented at almost the beginning of the story, would be a magical girl transformation, a trope often associated with beauty and maturity, here having obvious application. With the narrative and visual storytelling indicating a new source of power, the final gameplay sections here attempt to embody that feeling. First off, you can control Becky's movements again. I feel you could make the argument that the final section would still function just fine even if Becky moved on her own, and maybe that would be cool, but if the game is expressing a final moment of unity between Becky and the player character, then this feels like a suitable concession. Perhaps more importantly is that now you can keep shooting even with no ammo. The player is given the opportunity to see their unlimited firepower in a room or rooms on hard mode full of enemies. The third trick, which might ruin a bit of the magic once you figure it out, is that it's actually impossible to die at this point in the game. Even if you run right up to enemies, they won't hurt you. That's the main reason I think maybe Becky should have walked on her own, because it's not like anything bad could have happened from it except for the illusion potentially being shattered. As it is, the player is unlikely to take damage here naturally, as they can simply shoot down every enemy from a safe distance. Though I understand that if some fool or joker got stuck in the crowd, having to redo any of the last few sections might cheapen their impact. I might also assume that everything just being a normal enemy without the ability to deal damage was, at least to some extent, a consideration of convenience. This is most evident with the final boss, who appears to be Jasmine, completely possessed by the false god. But with the exception of her design, high health, and scripted movement to the center of the room, she is programmatically identical to the harmless enemies the player blasted through on the way here. Despite everything, I also like to think there's something profound about the enemy behavior here. A fun interpretation is to say that Becky's untouchable now, but I find it most interesting to imagine that after a lifetime of being molded to become the perfect host, suppressing her true self and desires in order to carry out filial obligations, the false god is limited and defeated in part because Jasmine's body literally can't bring itself to hurt her friend. If you're able to come to an understanding of her character motivations, then this ultimately feels like a satisfying little arc for her. She went from consciously endangering her friends to unconsciously protecting them. Usually I'd think avoiding having a final boss is a bit pretentious, but I feel like ultimately the almost haphazard presentation of this encounter manages to save it, while still claiming the benefit from the anticlimactic subversion. Now, I skipped over one of the final cutscenes because I think it deserves its own lengthy diatribe regarding my interpretation of Wendigo and K-Cross. I already said that Wendigo is associated with the symbolism of stagnation and failure, though this may be more or less obvious depending on whether or not you've seen Ending A before or after this one. Either way, wanting to bring back the dead is a perfect representation of stagnation, and feeling absolutely nothing when she's accomplished that goal is a clear example of failure. I could speculate, based on my previous theory about the mirror world causing neurological damage, that part of Wendigo's lack of emotion for her life's goal could be due to some lost memory. Just like the boy infatuated with Wendigo, she remembers the object of her obsession, she knows that she should care, hence why she drops her stoic facade when Becky passed out back in Act 2, but maybe she's forgotten the reason why she cared, the memories of life with Kelly that would have made reconciliation meaningful. That's at least a practical explanation I could imagine. But I think the middle stage between overarching thematic necessity and obscure practicality is a bit more interesting. Just as the reconciliation between Becky and Kelly could be read as art commentary, perhaps you could say the same about Wendigo and Kelly. Bringing Kelly back has been her obsession, her overall goal for most of her adult life. She's been trying to see this through for at least a decade. She's sacrificed so much of herself, and either from the process or the result, she's numb to it in the end. Even success is failure. There is a common idiom directed at any aspiring author about making a project more manageable and thus more likely to actually come to fruition, even at the cost of some aspect you are fond of. Murder your darlings. Wendigo's primary goal has been to undo the murder she committed against someone dear to her. Much like the idiom warns, the result has taken her forever, it wasn't a healthy pursuit, and ultimately it didn't make anything better for her. Wendigo once again implies that she and Becky are similar, but at this point Becky has matured into a very different person, in part due to K-Cross. I said earlier that Kelly Cross was the perfect player character, but maybe that's not entirely true. There are moments where the game provides an indication of a more active and aggressive personality, most concretely in the fact that Kelly apparently committed arson. Now, to be fair, the player might agree with the motivation upon seeing the horrors of the mirror world, but I imagine the average person is less inclined to go out and firebomb Walmart. And again, this might not actually be the same person, but this isn't the only example. It's possible that the outburst of violence that Becky directed at Jasmine was actually the influence of Kelly, seeing as the whole scene happens through the descriptive text with the symbol of K-Cross. Becky does occasionally display an unhealthy outburst, but this is pointed out as uncharacteristically violent, which implies an outside influence. However, it's not as if Kelly is the only presence within the mirror world, so honestly, I'm not sure whether I can attribute this to Becky or Kelly, or maybe a mix of both, or maybe neither, or maybe everything all at once. But there is one tidbit where it feels hard to imagine any other application. If you look at the game's banner art on Steam, you can vaguely discern rows of slightly faded overlapping text that seems to be from the perspective of someone killed by their own sister 20 years ago. From what I could extract, the victim clings to their memories out of anger, expressing a sense of unfairness and indignation. The text seems like the kind of thing that K-Cross might say to Wendigo in this moment, and if that did happen, then Wendigo's reaction would make perfect sense. However, the reactions the player can actually give in-game range from conciliatory to stern yet restrained. There is also the fact that it clearly gives a 20-year gap, which doesn't seem right. Lisa in the unreleased film poster looks at least plausibly like Becky, which would presumably mean she's around 18 or 20. The parallel to Becky in Ending A indicates Wendigo is around 30 now, with various bits of paratext outright stating she's exactly 32. Lisa being 12 back then, or 40 now, doesn't add up in my interpretation. With that in mind, I think this banner is meant less as a revelatory piece of hidden lore in plain sight and more of a general tone poem. Maybe this text at one point represented Kelly Cross, but it's hard to say it applies to what we see in-game. Honestly, all the things I've mentioned could imply that there was a solid concept for Kelly's character which was dropped during development in favor of the current approach. Considering how I just said that K-Cross might be a lesson on Murder Your Darlings, I wonder if that impression is actually intentional. Kelly Cross actually ending up a murdered darling could be a stroke of serendipity, but these little hints may have been invented specifically for this end. Either way, K-Cross adds another 3 layers of metaphor on top of the already existing concepts of the player character. There's another line in that banner that actually makes it into the main game, which I think might be related. Welcome to the bloodletting. Let disaster strike. End of the cycle. Bloodletting is an ancient practice of withdrawing blood in an attempt to cure illness and disease. While blood being taken from the characters literally happens within the game, it can also be seen as a metaphor for removing partisanling for the sake of improvement. Both this and the line, let disaster strike, lend themselves to the general concept of the struggle on the path for self-improvement. I think the art commentary interpretation that I've been focusing on for this bit works especially well. Whether it's drawing blood, personal improvement, or refining art, taking a bit might be good, but removing too much may be unhealthy. Either way, it's a painful process, but it may be necessary to let disaster strike, as it were. I think pairing the failure of Wendigo with the transformation of Becky shows a nuance of the story, on one hand showing the beauty of realizing a vision, and on the other showing the ugliness of clinging to an idea. Just as the character of Tomoro presents the complexity that the way of life Becky avoids may not be repellent to everyone, this part of the story feels like it's saying that between giving up and holding on, there is a golden mean of discernment. End of the cycle being the final bit of this caused me some confusion because I wasn't sure what in the game could be described as a cycle. Instead of assuming I'm just a moron and not seeing something obvious, I'll say that this is a general phrase to represent making progress and letting go. That fits neatly into the rest of my interpretation, and I think it's generally applicable to the dynamic between Wendigo and Kelly. I think that's pretty much all I have to say on my interpretation regarding specific parts of the story. I could speak on the epilogue, but there's really nothing I could say other than that it's beautiful and perfect and amazing. As I said before, I think it's good that the epilogue is locked behind the bonus challenges. Aside from generally giving weight to gameplay, these all serve as a unique test of skill application that isn't necessarily required in the main game. I also find they're a good testing ground for routing in their equivalent sections, which might incentivize the player to experience the game all over again, which works well alongside the potential novelty of the alternate costumes and different play modes. And maybe it's a bit late to be making a statement that sounds right out of a 5-minute review, but it's great to see bonus content that's built into the game as a matter of skill and exploration, that you don't have to buy as a scummy microtransaction. I really do love how the game is constructed. A lot of what I've interpreted from the text took me a lot of time to puzzle out. Not just because the information is just scattered and obscure, but because there's a genuine literary depth to the meaning of everything. There are some details and connections which only stood out to me as meaningful when I was in the process of editing this very video. Almost a year after I first played the game, and with hours and hours of thinking it over, I'm still able to make a new discovery every time. There's plenty of details which I couldn't find a place for in this video, and which I might not have even noticed myself yet, even still. I would compare this form of storytelling to what is perhaps the most relevant example, the Silent Hill series, although those games were before my time. A lot of games like this were so popular by the time I discovered them that I didn't have to do much of the discovery on my own. Having seen how some people talk about this game, that's a critical distinction that should be recognized. There's something fun and personal about getting to do that, but I hope I've shown that Studio System doesn't need to use discovery as a crutch necessarily. I would argue that there are many themes that jump out, even to a new player, that the game still explores in depth, without you needing to understand everywhere it goes. I do think there are some examples where a theme could be extended, or at least that some highlight could be put on those extensions. Violation of autonomy comes up quite a bit in this game, through the various forms of possession and transformation. Well, you could read this as a general metaphor for the alienation and pressure the game looks at. You can also see it as a very specific extension of what causes those things. For example, outside of its generally corrupting influence, the false god growing in power is described with words including womb and fetal, with its ultimate goal of manifesting through a host being described as birth. Mike Campbell, leader of the faction who endangered and sacrificed countless young lives in pursuit of ensuring the birth of the false god, seems to have turned into a monster with a chainsaw sticking out of its head, a tool originally invented to assist in childbirth. When you view it from that lens, his transformation becomes a pretty apt metaphor. But this theory of meaning depends on a number of assumptions and associations, which, even if true, don't necessarily indicate that the commentary should extend to the main characters. You know, the game doesn't exactly elucidate how they would feel about this particular subject. One might say maybe I'm reading too deep into it. And even if I could make a more convincing argument, there's a difference between exploring a topic and merely acknowledging it. The birth of a god is not quite as central or upfront in visual storytelling and character motivation in Studio System as something like Silent Hill 3, for example. But there's a reason I feel positively about much of the other subtler symbolism and subject matter, and why I was even willing to think through everything this much. Even putting aside my pre-existing understanding of whatever topic and intertextual associations from other works, Studio System is emotionally evocative. Through the narrative, not only is further empathy built with the characters through the display of naturalistic behavior indicating humanity, but associations can be made between symbols within the game world and circumstances of the characters. Or, to put it another way, the terror of the fake Tomoro parallels the discomfort Becky feels towards the real Tomoro, regardless of how significant one may perceive the difference between the two. And my interpretation of Becky's transformation in the preceding moments might be completely insane insane and largely disagreeable, but still, the sense of alienation and connection is palpable to me. Alienation is really the key word for me here. In the past, I've railed on the use of ambiguity as a tool to avoid alienation through making definitive statements. I probably will in the future, because I do find it frustrating when a work either has very little to say or authors that hide behind layers and layers of irony. But I don't think Studio System employs ambiguity to avoid saying anything, especially considering that the alienation is part of the point. It wouldn't really make sense after all. Instead, I believe the technical ambiguity allows for the interpretation of multiple distinct statements. All this talk I've given about being unable to pin down what single concept ties together the color blue is exemplary of that. The colors are representative of the characters and the endings, and even that alone makes them quite broad, but they're also attached to what are clearly symbolically meaningful set pieces within the game. Studio System is, in my interpretation, a story about society, about the self-improvement of an individual, about art, and about the interplay of society, the individual, and art. And so, its construction is suited to allow for those interpretations, and likely more that I haven't even considered, let alone discussed here. Which is all to say, aside from the base appeal of all constituent elements, there is actual substance to be found within the work. Speaking of which, this video was quite substantial, as you can probably tell, so I hope nobody minds if I speak a bit about my process. Every video I make has the primary goal of being informative in analysis for techniques that can be applied in the creation of art, or for further analysis, and the secondary goal of persuading the viewer regarding the quality of the work. For Studio System, I want people who played it to think more highly of it, and I want people who haven't played it to go out and buy it. And not just because I find the philosophy, talent, and effort of the developer to be admirable and worthy of recognition in and of itself. I've been reluctant to make any direct comparison for fear of being inflammatory, but I haven't been all too satisfied with many recent popular offerings in the horror game genre. I feel that, issues of quality aside, they often lack what I found compelling about classic titles. Studio System feels like the antidote for that. The skill-based proactive play that lends itself well to replayability, the depthful writing that's neither blunt nor overly ambiguous, the genuinely cinematic presentation that nonetheless rejects the conventional orthodoxy of retro or realistic style. And despite sharing traits with staples of the genre, it's not reliant upon unimaginative imitation of them. The references and bits of inspirations feel ultimately minor in comparison to elements that feel intimate to or characteristic of this game in particular. For Studio System, it doesn't just maintain solid foundations, I can say that there is a unique appeal and identity. No other game has a camera like this, and no other game goes this far in its exploration of that mechanic. I have no problem with a horror game that strays from foundational convention. Hopefully my channel is itself evidence that I can appreciate variety. It's just that I want to see popular horror games that have something about which I can genuinely say, no other game does it like this one. At least that's part of my motivation to influence opinion. It's sort of a difficult thing, that I want to influence opinion, I want people to know about this game and understand its value, and to do that I have to make a video that people will want to watch. For that end, I've used what I hope is very careful and strategic use of summarization, which I know is good for attention. I can only hope that the people who might have even been 1% interested in the game stopped watching at some point to go check it out, and I tell myself that everyone else just never would have bought it, no matter how hard I tried to sell it to them. Not to discredit my own job, taking something abstract and complicated and putting it into comprehensible and logical statements is useful for the sake of understanding. But if that's the only vector of experience for you, then you're losing out on what makes it emotionally effective. The way the game plays with alienation and synchronicity can really only be felt through the interactive medium, and it's probably best felt as an experience of a person on their own, rather than expressed vicariously with another. I can attest, having played Studio System mostly on my own and discovering all of it without any spoiler, that it's left a very profound effect on me. I must admit, I see a lot of myself reflected in Becky. To some extent, my interpretation of the game may be a matter of projection. But when I was around Becky's age, I delayed going to college, in part because I lived in anxiety over being perceived by other people. And then there comes along this game with a protagonist struggling to actually dictate her own future, defined by her alienation from others, in a world filled with the symbolism of eyes and cameras. It honestly felt all the more real to me when I played Times Infinity and saw a game once again defined by aimlessness in young adulthood. I still feel more entranced by Studio System in this regard, because while Times Infinity is fantastic about capturing the feeling of being directionless, it focuses on that without putting as much into asking, okay, what next? I personally speculate this might be a goal of a potential Times Infinity continuation. However, Studio System feels like it goes even further. It presents different sources and posits individual outcomes. And the entire experience of the game is centered around the concepts of struggle and self-improvement. It's easier to compromise or to simply avoid doing anything. But if you settle, if you fail to act, then nothing can get better. I started writing this script literally the week the game came out. What I initially thought would be a video I could finish in a month or so turned into a project where I wanted to put in a lot more care and effort. I worked on a bunch of other smaller projects in the interim so I could give this one more time and thought in between. I especially wanted to try and play through as many of the game's inspirations as I could because I wanted to increase my knowledge of the general medium, so I could speak on similarities and comparisons from a well-informed position. At around the point I started taking this video seriously, I thought by the time it comes out, I should be able to say I've internalized the message. Embarrassing as it feels to admit that I made the conscious decision to motivate myself based on my desire to talk about a video game, I feel I'm much better off for it. I went out more often and did things I normally wouldn't for the sake of being able to say and to show that I did. I've been wanting to lose weight for years now, and after stalling on good progress early on last year, giving myself a timed goal with this video motivated me to buckle down, count calories, and at least go on a walk every day. And, well, I expanded my horizons, both in the field of gaming and in real life. I weigh around 125 pounds now, and I feel better about being seen. I can quite literally say that Studio System changed me, emotionally and physically in a way. And for that, to Uil, I can only say, thank you for everything.